The shelter on Kaufman Street ran out of hot water by 5:30 most mornings, which meant Mara Voss had learned to wake at 4 if she wanted a shower that didn't feel like standing under a garden hose left out overnight in November. She'd been at Cedar Ridge Women's Shelter for 11 weeks, long enough to know which cots creaked, which women talked in their sleep, which pipes groaned behind the walls before dawn like something trying to get out. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 11 weeks was a long stay by the shelter's unwritten standards, and the case manager who came by on Thursdays had started using phrases like sustainable path forward and next steps in the careful, deliberate tone of someone counting down to a hard conversation. Mara was 19 years old. She had $214 in a savings account she checked on her phone more often than she should, a part-time job washing dishes at Peabody's Diner on Route 9, and a duffel bag under her cot that held everything she owned. She'd aged out of foster care in September, 4 months ago, and the transition had gone more or less the way the social worker had warned her it might. A handshake, a manila folder of resource pamphlets printed on paper that felt like it already knew it was going to be ignored, and a check for $500 that covered 2 weeks of rent at a rooming house on the east side of Harlan and nothing after. Harlan, Montana was not the place she had imagined ending up, but it was where her last foster placement had been, and when that placement ended, she hadn't had a compelling reason to go anywhere else. She didn't have people in other places. She didn't have people here, either, not really, but she knew where the diner was and which roads got icy first, and how long it took to walk from Cedar Ridge to the laundromat on Cedar Street when the temperature dropped below zero and the shelter's dryers were all in use. That kind of knowledge felt like something, even when it wasn't much. The morning of January 14th started the way all of them started. She rose at 4, showered in water that went lukewarm before she was done, dressed in the gray-blue light before the other women stirred, and walked the 3/4 mile to Peabody's through air so cold it felt like something solid pressing against her face. Del had her start early on Saturdays to prep the kitchen before the weekend breakfast crowd, which meant 6 a.m., and a mug of coffee that tasted like a decision made under duress and the low, companionable clatter of the grill warming up and someone on the radio describing road conditions north of Billings. She worked until noon. The rush came and went. Del counted out her cash from the register's petty box without ceremony, the bills soft from handling. She folded them into her coat pocket, pulled on her gloves, and walked back out into the January afternoon. The cold hit clean and immediate. The sky the pale, characterless white of midwinter, the streets quiet the way small Montana towns got quiet after the morning rush, and before anything else decided to happen. Most Saturdays, she went to the library. The Harlan Public Library stayed open until 5, and the reading room in the back had chairs that were actually comfortable, armchairs with flattened cushions that had been sat in hard enough to conform to the general shape of the people who used them. She spent a lot of time there. Architecture books, mostly, the old ones with photographs of buildings and places she'd never been, structures designed with a patience and specificity that felt almost foreign in a world that had developed a taste for tearing things down. She'd thought about architecture once, when thinking about the future still felt like a thing she was permitted to do. But that afternoon she didn't go to the library. She took the long way back, following old logging road out of town because the cold had that particular quality it sometimes got in January. Not sharp and hostile, but oddly still, the air holding itself in a way that made the whole world feel like it was waiting on something. The snow was packed hard underfoot, crunching with each step in a way that was somehow satisfying, and the road ran straight north out of Harlan for about a mile before bending east toward the ridge line. She walked it because the shelter had 32 women in it, and sometimes she needed to be somewhere that was none of them. She walked it because she had nowhere to be, and walking was the cheapest version of somewhere. The forest pressed in on both sides. Lodgepole pines and Douglas firs, their lower branches thick with snow and perfectly still in the absence of wind. She'd been out here a dozen times at least, always following the same bend east, always turning back around the same place. It was a walk, not a destination. She understood the difference. She'd been going about 20 minutes when she saw the smoke. It rose from somewhere behind the tree line to the northeast, thin and pale gray against the winter sky, a single column curling upward in a slow, deliberate spiral before coming apart against the clouds. She stopped walking. Nothing out here was supposed to have a fire. She'd walked this road enough to know there were no houses past the bend, no structures the county had marked on any of the trail maps at the library's information desk. The smoke was wrong for a controlled burn, too steady, too narrow. Whatever was producing it had been going long enough to settle into a rhythm. She stood in the road and watched it for a moment. Then she told herself it was someone's. Campfire, or a trash pile, or a hunter who'd built a warm spot in the trees. None of her concern. She kept walking. Except she didn't. She stood there in the cold watching the smoke, and something in her chest pulled toward it in a way she couldn't have articulated to anyone and didn't try to articulate to herself. She'd spent 19 years learning not to follow things toward uncertain places. Foster care taught that particular lesson early and consistently. You learned that warmth could be withdrawn, that open doors were also closable doors, that hope had a weight to it that made falling harder. She understood that the way she understood the price of bread and the layout of the shelter and the exact number of steps between her cot and the bathroom. She turned off the road and walked toward the smoke anyway. The forest floor between the road and the ridge was rough going. Old snowfall had frozen into uneven ridges and hollows that caught her boots without warning, and the trees grew closer here, their canopy cutting off what thin light the January sky was willing to offer. For several minutes, she couldn't see anything but more trees and more snow and the thin line of her own breath in the cold air. She started thinking she'd misjudged the direction, that she'd lose the angle of the smoke in the canopy and end up 20 minutes deeper into the woods with nothing to show for it. Then she crested a shallow rise and saw the cabin. It sat in a clearing maybe 80 feet across, small enough that the surrounding forest made it look like something left behind by someone in a hurry. The walls were hewn log, old-growth timber gone almost black with decades of weather, the gaps filled with pale chinking that had cracked and been repaired and cracked again in a pattern that suggested a very long argument between the building and the climate. The roof was steeply pitched, metal sheeting gone orange-brown with rust, still holding its shape. One window on the front wall, small and frosted, letting no light in or out. A door set deep in the frame. No visible handle from where she stood. A stone chimney at the east end with the smoke coming out of it, steady and thin, the smoke she'd followed through the trees. Mara stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a long time. The clearing was otherwise silent. No vehicle tracks in the snow, no equipment, no signs that anyone used the place regularly. But someone had a fire going. The smoke was too consistent to be accidental. And there were boot prints in the snow, old ones, half buried by a day's worth of drift, leading from the east side of the clearing to the door and stopping there. Whoever had made them had gone inside and not come back out since the last snowfall, which had been 2 days ago. She was 20 feet from the door when she noticed what was sitting on the step. A piece of paper, folded once and held down by a small stone, the edges curled from moisture but the fold still clean. Someone had placed it there deliberately. Not dropped, placed. She looked at it for a moment without moving. The paper was white enough against the gray of the step that it stood out clearly, almost like it had been put there to be found. She crossed the rest of the clearing and crouched, and picked it up, pulling off her right glove to get enough dexterity to open it. Her fingers were already stiff from the cold. The paper was thick, the quality used for legal documents, and the handwriting inside was cramped and slanting forward, the hand of someone writing with urgency rather than patience. For whoever finds this place, come in. The stove is running low, but there is wood behind the left wall. This cabin belongs to the family of August Voss. If you are Mara, this is yours. She read it twice. Then a third time, standing in the cold of a Montana January in a clearing she'd stumbled into by following smoke, holding a piece of paper with her name on it, written by a hand she didn't recognize, left on the doorstep of a building she hadn't known existed. The coldness in her chest had nothing to do with the temperature. She pushed the door open. It swung inward on stiff hinges, the wood frame swollen slightly from cold and moisture, but not stuck. The smell reached her first, wood smoke and pine resin, and something beneath those, older and settled, like the inside of a trunk that had been closed for years. She stepped in and let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The cabin was a single room with a loft above, reached by a ladder nailed to the back wall. The floor was rough-cut planks, uneven but solid, the boards worn smooth in the paths between the stove and the door and the workbench. The cast iron stove dominated the right side of the room, its door closed, a faint orange seam of light showing at the gap where the door met the frame. The wood supply was stacked against the left wall, and behind a low partition, split logs, enough for 2 days if she was careful. Against the far wall, a workbench covered in papers and tools and objects she couldn't immediately name. A shelf above it holding mason jars of various sizes and colors, some labeled, some not. In the corner nearest the door, a wooden chair with a green wool blanket folded over its back with the kind of care that suggested habit rather than tidiness. On the workbench, a second piece of paper, held down by a rusted compass. She crossed to it. This note was longer, written in the same hand but smaller and more compressed, like the writer had more to say and less room than they'd anticipated. I have been waiting to leave this. The property survey is in the red tin box under the workbench. Tax records are in the folder behind it. Everything is paid current. The land is 180 acres, recorded in Harlan County since 1948 under August Voss, your grandfather. He passed in July. No will was filed with the county. You are the only blood heir. What is here is legally and completely yours, but knowing that is the beginning, not the end of it. There are people who have wanted this land for a long time. Before you do anything, find Elda Marsh on Birch Street in Harlan. She is 74 years old, and she knew August, and she knows what you'll need to know. Do not speak with anyone at the county offices before you speak to her. This is not a small thing to ask. F.M. F.M. The initials meant nothing to her, but the rest of it did. August Voss. Her grandfather. The name Voss was the one thing she'd always had. Her mother's name. Her name, a word that had never attached itself to a story. For letters, she'd written on school enrollment forms and medical intake paperwork in the bottom of public assistance applications without ever knowing who had carried it before her. Now there was a name in front of it, August, and after it, a date, and a piece of land in the Montana mountains, and a note left by a stranger telling her it was hers. She found the chair by the stove and sat down in it. The fire was fading. She could feel it in the air, the way warmth was beginning to separate into layers, hot near the ceiling and cool near the floor, the stove losing the argument with the January cold outside. She should add wood. The sensible thing was to add wood and keep the place warm and then think through what she was sitting in the middle of. Instead, she sat with both pieces of paper folded in her lap and looked at the room around her. Mara Voss had been in 12 foster placements between the ages of 4 and 18. She remembered some of them clearly, others in fragments, the way memories come when you're not sure whether you want to keep them. Her mother had died when she was 4, cause listed in the paperwork as an acute overdose, a phrase she hadn't understood for years, and then had understood all at once and all wrong, and then eventually arrived at something like the truth of it. She had never known her father. The state's file on her said father unknown in the field where a name might have gone, and no one had ever explained whether that meant unknown to her mother, unknown to the system, or simply not asked. She had been told, at different points by 2 different caseworkers, that she had no living relatives. This had been stated as a matter of uncomplicated fact, the same way you'd state that a bus didn't run on Sundays, or that a particular form had to be filed in duplicate. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles, no family at all. She had believed it the way you believe things you have no means to check, because in 12 placements across the state of Montana, belief and evidence were often different things, and you learned to work with whatever was available. But someone had known she existed. Someone had known her name. Someone had lit a fire in a cabin in the Montana woods and left a piece of paper on the doorstep and told her to come in. She fed the stove 2 logs, closed the iron door, and listened to the wood begin to catch. The red tin box under the workbench was exactly where the note said. She pulled it out and opened it on the floor. Inside, a property survey on thick paper, the kind drafted by hand with careful lines and compass notations, dated 1968, with an amended layer in red pen from 1991 that added a second set of markings over the original. Beneath the survey, a county tax receipt from the previous October, paid in full, covering 180 acres on the northeast boundary of Harlan County. Behind the box, a manila folder holding a sheaf of papers clipped in order, the chain of ownership going back to 1948, when a deed of purchase had moved the land from a mining company to August Wilhelm Voss of Harlan, Montana. Price paid, $1,200. Surveyed and recorded. She spread the documents on the floor around her and read through them in the order they were organized, the way she'd learned to approach things that were complicated but had a structure if you looked for it. The amended survey in red pen caught her attention first. Someone had added a series of dotted lines across the lower third of the property, following the natural contours of the ridge, and next to one cluster of those lines, in pencil so faint it was barely legible, a notation, Corundum presence confirmed, 1991. CSA reports, secure location. She didn't know the word. She wrote it carefully in the margin with the pencil from the workbench. She would look it up. The manila folder held more. A series of carboned letters, copies of typed correspondence, the originals sent to addresses in Billings, and once to Washington. The letters were from August, signed A. W. Voss, formal and specific in the way of someone who had learned to choose words carefully in official contexts. They were addressed to land management offices, a state geological survey bureau, twice to the office of a congressman she didn't recognize. Each letter was a request for records. Survey boundaries, mineral extraction permits filed adjacent to the parcel, documentation of a lease agreement August described as having been issued in error in 1993. The responses, when they existed, were short and uninformative. Thank you for your inquiry. The matter has been reviewed. We find no irregularities. No further action is indicated at this time. The language of institutions declining to be troubled. The last letter in the folder was not from August. It came on company letterhead, addressed to him, from something called Halcyon Resource Group, LLC. The date was March of the previous year, 4 months before August Voss died. Dear Mr. Voss, we reach out once more to reiterate our interest in the mineral rights underlying your parcel. Our offer, as previously discussed, remains at $85,000 for a full mineral rights conveyance, which we believe reflects a generous valuation given current market conditions. We encourage you to consider this offer carefully. The alternative paths available to our company, including petitioning the county for a boundary resurvey and pursuing adverse possession claims through the courts, are options we prefer to avoid. They remain available to us. We look forward to your response. Mara read it once through quickly, then again, slowly. They had offered $85,000 for the mineral rights. August had apparently declined. For months later he was dead, and the land had gone to no one, and a company had been waiting for exactly that outcome. She put the letter back in the folder. She held the folder against her coat for a moment and looked at the window, the frosted glass going gray with the light change of late afternoon, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite fury but existed in the space between them, the particular feeling of understanding that someone had been counting on you not to show up. She put everything back in the tin box, put the box under the workbench, fed the stove one more log. Then she looked around the cabin the way she hadn't let herself look before, slowly, deliberately, as someone taking stock of what she owned. The shelves above the workbench held mason jars she now looked at differently. Several were labeled in faded permanent marker with dates from the early 1990s and alphanumeric codes that might have been site designations. Some held what looked like soil. Some held small stones, dull and ordinary-looking, ranging from gray-brown to a deep reddish-green she wouldn't have known the significance of yet. The tools on the workbench included things she recognized, hammer, hand drill, chisels, and things she didn't, instruments with the look of precision equipment, a small hand lens on a leather cord, a rock pick with the head worn smooth from use, a set of small metal tubes that would turn out to be sample containers. In the loft, she found the cot and the wooden crate of books. The spines were cracked and the pages annotated in a cramped hand that she already recognized as August's. One title, Corundum and Associated Mineral Deposits of the Northern Rockies, had been read so many times the binding had given up its glue. She opened to a page folded down repeatedly until the paper was nearly translucent at the crease. Montana Sapphires. The entry described the Yogo Gulch deposit in central Montana, the most documented in the state, and noted the presence of less characterized deposits along certain northeast ridge formations, confirmed in survey work conducted through the 1970s and 80s, some of commercial quality. Most of them claimed early and quietly by companies with the resources to act before landowners fully understood what they were sitting on. She stood in the loft with the book open in her hands and felt the pieces assembling themselves around her. She climbed back down and sat in the chair by the stove and stayed until the January light was fully gone from the window and the fire had settled into a steady, reliable burn. Then she walked back through the dark woods to Old Logging Road, strips of red cloth from her jacket lining tied to 3 different trees so she could find the clearing again, and she didn't let herself run, though the cold and everything else conspired to make running feel reasonable. Back at the shelter, she ate dinner without tasting it and lay on her cot after lights out with the pages of August's correspondence spread in her head like a floor plan, and she lay there thinking until the shelter quieted down around her and the only sounds were the pipes in the walls and the distant traffic on Route 9. Birch Street was 2 blocks east of the library, a short residential stretch of small houses with covered porches and yards that probably had flower beds in summer. In January, they were just white and brown, and the occasional cluster of dried hydrangea, heads gone the color of old paper. Number 14 had a wooden sign by the gate with E. Marsh carved into it and painted blue, years ago from the look of the weathering. Mara had stopped at the library first. She'd spent 40 minutes at the reference computer looking up 2 things. The first was corundum. The second was Halcyon Resource Group. Corundum was the mineral form of aluminum oxide. In gem quality, depending on trace elements, it was sapphire or ruby. Montana had substantial deposits along several ridge formations in the central and northern counties. Commercial quality deposits, the geological literature said, were estimated to range in value from tens of millions to several $100 million depending on size, quality, and accessibility. The Yogo Gulch sapphires sold for between $400 and $500 a carat for commercial grade at current market prices, considerably more for exceptional specimens. A deposit large enough to support extraction operations over a 20 to 30-year period represented the kind of value that made $85,000 look like a joke told at someone else's expense. Halcyon Resource Group had no public website, no news coverage beyond a single mention in a 2011 trade publication describing a mining rights acquisition in central Montana. A state business registration, active since 1998, under a registered agent whose address was a legal firm in Billings. The parent company was a Delaware LLC she couldn't trace without access to databases that cost money she didn't have. She had stood at the library terminal with those 2 searches open on the screen and felt something harden quietly in her chest, the same thing she'd felt reading the March letter, but clarified now, more specific. She stood at Elda Marsh's gate and looked at the painted sign. Then she pushed the gate open. The woman who answered the door was 74 years old and built like someone who had spent a long time deciding that weather and difficulty were things to be moved through rather than around. She was small but carried herself with the density of a person who had long since stopped negotiating with space. Gray hair cut close and practical. Very dark eyes that registered Mara and then kept registering her, the way people look when they're comparing what they see to something they've been carrying in their head. "You're Helena's girl," she said. Not a question. Mara stood on the porch step. "I don't know who told you that." "Nobody told me anything." Elda Marsh stepped back. "You've got her eyes and August's jaw. Come inside. It's cold." The kitchen smelled of coffee and something baking that Mara couldn't identify, and it was warm the way old houses get warm, deeply, through the walls, not just from a heater, but from years of living. Elda set a mug down in front of Mara without asking and sat across from her with her own. "How did you find the cabin?" "I followed the smoke." Elda was quiet for a moment. "The smoke. Someone had a fire going." "I know." Elda's hands wrapped around her mug. "That was me. I've been keeping it lit since November. August asked me to, before he died. He said his granddaughter would come eventually. He said she'd follow the smoke." A pause. "I think he meant it as a test, in a way. Not of you. Of whether the thing he believed about you was true." "What did he believe about me?" "That you'd be paying attention." Elda's voice was even, carrying neither sentiment nor its absence. "That you'd see something most people would walk past." Mara looked at the table. "He never tried to contact me." "He tried." There was no softening in the way Elda said it, and no excess of defensiveness either, just the weight of something she'd been living with. "When your mother died, the state notified next of kin. August was listed on Helena's file as her father. He was 62 and had recently had 2 strokes and was struggling to manage the property on his own. By the time he was well enough to do anything practical about reaching you, you'd been in the system 3 years. He contacted the county services. They told him disrupting a stable placement was not in your best interest. I was never in a stable placement for more than 2 years. I know that. August eventually knew it too. But the system does not bend easily for elderly men in rural Montana who don't have lawyers, and August was not the kind of man who asked for help until asking was the only option left. She paused. He was stubborn in ways that served him and ways that didn't. Mara thought about 12 placements and a check for $500 and the word sustainable spoken in a case manager's careful voice. What was he fighting with Halcyon? Elda stood and went to a cabinet, came back with a thick manila envelope, aged and handled, the envelope of something that had been picked up and put down many times. She set it on the table between them. In 1991, August hired a private geological firm out of Billings to survey the lower portion of his land. He'd been finding stones on the property for years and hadn't thought much of them until a professor from the state university came through for a different project and recognized what one of them was. The survey confirmed a significant corundum deposit running along the northeast ridge and down through the lower meadow. How significant? Elda held still for a moment, the kind of still that precedes a number. The 1991 assay valued it conservatively at $40 to $60 million at then current prices. Montana sapphire prices have more than doubled since then. Extraction technology has improved enough to access depths the 1991 survey couldn't reach economically. Independent estimates, based on what August documented and what I've had reviewed privately, put the current value somewhere around $250 million, possibly higher. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind shifted and the house made the small sound of a structure adjusting to weather. The letter from Halcyon said $85,000, Mara said. They've been lowballing him for 30 years. Elda's voice held the specific quality of anger that has run out of heat, but not out of truth. The first offer was in 1992, $22,000. They assumed he didn't understand what was there. When he didn't take it, they came back higher. Each time he refused, they found new ways to make his life difficult. A dispute over the 1991 survey methodology. A boundary line challenge in 1999 that became a lawsuit taking 3 years and most of his savings to win. Irregular inspections from county offices. The kind of pressure that doesn't come with a name attached to it, but wears you down regardless. She turned the envelope on the table. They wanted to pay him almost nothing for something worth everything. And when he wouldn't cooperate, they decided to wait. He was old. He had no family they knew of. Eventually he'd die. The land would go to the county for back taxes, and they'd acquire it through a quiet auction. The taxes are paid. I paid them. The last 8 quarters he couldn't manage, I covered them. He paid me back when he could. Toward the end, he stopped being able to. She said it without drama. He was my friend for 40 years. He was right about what was on that land, and no one would listen to him, and he deserved at least one person who believed him. Mara felt something press at the back of her throat, and she did not let it through. They're going to know I'm here. Within a day or two. They have a contact at the county clerk's office. When the inheritance paperwork is processed, they'll know. Elda slid the envelope across the table. These are August's complete records. The original assay reports, the full boundary survey, 30 years of correspondence with Halcyon and with every state and federal office he wrote to asking for an investigation that never came. His attorney in Billings retired 2 years ago and gave these to me before he left. His name is David Aurelius. He's in Oregon now, possibly still reachable, but you'd need someone currently licensed. Do you know someone? Yes. Elda reached into her flannel shirt pocket and set a card on the table. Soren Patel. She practiced with the state attorney general's office for 8 years before going private. Her practice is mineral rights and land disputes. Specifically, she grew up in coal country in eastern Montana, and she does not settle cheap. A pause. I've had her name ready for 14 months. Since August died. Mara picked up the card. There's something else, Elda said, and her voice shifted slightly, losing the quality of someone delivering briefings and acquiring the quality of someone choosing words. August found something toward the end. Before he got too sick to go out on the property. He never told me the full details. He said it was better I didn't know until the time came. He said there was something inside the cabin that he'd hidden carefully, something that changed the scale of what was out there. Mara looked at her. He said the sapphires were the beginning. The wind pressed against the kitchen window. The clock somewhere in the house kept its quiet ticking. He left the hidden room behind a paneled wall on the north side of the cabin, Elda said. He paneled over it sometime in the 90s. You'd have to look for the seam. She went to the hook by the back door and came back with a key ring, 2 keys on it, and set it on the table. Front door and the padlock on the storage room door. Mara picked up the ring. Who left the notes? The ones in the cabin. Francis Medler. He was a state land assessor for 30 years before he retired. He and August went back to the beginning of all this. He came by the cabin in November to make sure the property was in order, left the note in case I couldn't keep the fire going consistently. Elda's expression didn't change, exactly, but it held something careful. He used his initials rather than his name in case someone else found it first. He's cautious. He has reason to be. Should I talk to him? After you talk to Soren. In that order. Elda walked her to the door. Don't use your bank card outside Harlan. Don't tell the shelter staff where you're going. Don't drive out to the property the same way twice. She held the door. And Mara turned. Don't go to the county offices before Soren arrives. Not for anything. They'll log the visit, and Halcyon will know within hours. Are they dangerous? Elda held the door against the cold a moment. August spent 30 years refusing them and died at 71 with his fight unfinished and no one to carry it forward. I can't prove anything about his decline. But when a corporation waits that long and spends that much, and a man dies 4 months after their last rejected offer, dangerous is one reasonable word for it. Mara stepped off the porch. The cold hit her full face, the January air precise and still. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. Elda held her gaze. Go find what he hid. She called Soren Patel from a payphone at the library, the last one in Harlan, outside near the bike racks, while the cold worked its way through her coat. The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered. Voice clipped, direct, unhurried. Patel Legal. My name is Mara Voss. She kept her voice even. I've inherited property in Harlan County. I need to speak with someone about mineral rights before I file the inheritance paperwork with the county. A pause, brief but deliberate. Is this related to the Voss parcel on the northeast ridge? Mara looked at the parking lot, the library sign, the sky going pale and flat above the town. You already know about it. David Aurelius sent my office a briefing package 14 months ago with a request that I be available should the Voss heir make contact. The voice was careful the way a precise tool is careful. He described it as likely to be a significant case. He was right. I think you should come to Harlan. Another pause, shorter. I can be there Thursday. Is there anything you've already done regarding the property, filings, contact with county offices, any communications with Halcyon Resource Group? Nothing filed. No contact with anyone except Elda Marsh, who you probably know about. And I've been in the cabin. Don't go back to the cabin alone after dark. And don't file anything with the county. A slight shift in the quality of the silence. What do you mean, you've been in the cabin? There's a hidden storage room behind a paneled wall on the north side. August's note told me about it. I found the door, but I haven't opened it yet. Elda gave me the key. The pause this time was 4 full seconds. What did you find in the main room? The property survey. Tax records. 30 years of correspondence. A letter from Halcyon offering $85,000 for the mineral rights 4 months before he died. Photograph everything before you move a single item. Soren Patel's voice had moved from careful to urgent without becoming loud. Document the exact location of each object. Do not remove anything from the property. And if anyone from Halcyon or anyone representing them makes contact, record it however you can and say nothing about what you found. Understood. Thursday. She confirmed it. I'll call. Wednesday evening with the meeting location. In the meantime, be unpredictable. Vary your routes. And if you feel at any point that someone is following you, leave the area and call me directly. Mara ended the call and stood at the payphone for a moment with the cold pressing in around her. She had $214. A duffel bag under a cot at Cedar Ridge. A job washing dishes for a man named Dell who paid in cash and didn't ask questions. Everything she'd had that morning was still true. She also had a key to a hidden room in a frozen cabin in the Montana mountains and a dead man's letter telling her that what was inside changed the scale of things. She went back to the shelter, ate dinner, and lay on her cot after lights out reading August's files by the small lamp until her eyes gave out. The picture that assembled itself from 30 years of correspondence was one she recognized, not in the details but in the structure of it. A person who knew the truth, telling people who had the power to do something about it, and being told repeatedly that they were mistaken, confused, or simply not important enough to take seriously. A person fighting alone because the system designed to prevent exactly this kind of theft had been made comfortable enough to look away. She'd spent 19 years in systems designed to help her that had mostly looked away. She understood what it cost to fight that. She also understood what it cost not to. She fell asleep with August's files still spread across the blanket and dreamed about smoke rising straight and true into a gray winter sky. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She went back to the cabin the following afternoon, a Sunday, the road empty and the sky the same flat gray it had been all week. She varied her route the way Soren had said, coming around the long way on the east side, parking the shelter's borrowed bike a quarter-mile from where old logging road bent north. She walked the last stretch through the trees rather than on the road, following her red cloth markers. The clearing looked the same as it always had. Small and patient, the cabin at the center of it like something waiting out a long argument with time. She built the fire first, fed it carefully until the warmth was established and the chill had retreated to the edges of the room. Then she went to the north wall. The paneling looked identical to the rest of the interior. The same rough-cut boards stained the same dark color by decades of wood smoke and weather. She ran her hand along the surface, pressing gently, testing the flex. She found the difference 3 feet from the left corner, a hairline seam, barely visible, running floor to ceiling. She pressed the boards on the left side of the seam and heard a faint click, and the panel shifted. Behind it, a door. Heavy oak, 3 inches at least, iron hinges set deep in the frame. A padlock, newer than everything else in the room, the kind chosen for reliability over everything else. The second key on the ring. She tried it. The lock turned. The door swung inward. The room beyond was small, 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep, built into the exterior of the cabin with a precision that made it invisible from outside, even if you were looking. The walls were the original log construction, the chinking tight and dry. The floor was poured concrete, cold through her boots, even standing in the doorway. Shelves on both side walls, floor to ceiling, and on them, lined up with the orderliness of someone who had been doing this for decades and meant it to last, numbered metal boxes, sealed, 37 of them by her count, stacked 2 and 3 deep. On the floor below the shelves, a wooden crate sealed with heavy staples and a padlock, the wood stamped with nothing, leaving no indication of what was inside. Above everything, on a hook in the center of the back wall, an envelope. She took the envelope down. Her name was on the front. August's handwriting, the cramped, urgent script she'd seen in the notes and letters. Her name, written by a man she'd never met, who had known she would come. She carried it back to the main room, sat in the chair by the stove, and opened it. The letter was 6 pages, written by hand on plain paper, each page numbered in the corner. The handwriting changed across the pages, she noticed, becoming slightly less controlled toward the end, the hand of someone whose strength was inconsistent. He'd written it in stages. Over time. Mara, it began. I don't know exactly who you are yet, because I haven't been able to find you. But I know you exist, and I know your name. And if you're reading this, it means you found the cabin the way I always thought you would, which tells me something about you already. What is in this room is going to take some explaining. I am going to be as clear as I can because you will need to understand all of it before you decide what to do. The sapphires are the beginning. The deposit on this land is real, and it is worth more than anyone has been willing to say publicly, though Halcyon knows the number and has always known it. But the sapphires are not the whole of it. In 1993, working on the lower meadow east of the second marker, I found something I had not expected to find. It took me several years to understand what I had, and several more to understand that Halcyon knew about it too, that they had known before I did, that this was part of why they wanted this land so badly and for so long. What is in the numbered boxes on the shelves is documentation, survey evidence, assay reports from 3 independent geological firms. Photographic records. Samples I pulled and stored and had analyzed at my own cost over 30 years, a little at a time, so no one would notice the pattern. The evidence shows that the deposit on this property does not end at my property line. It extends northeast, under the adjacent ridge, across what is currently classified as federal land, in a formation that runs continuous and documented for at least another 400 acres. A deposit of that size, properly surveyed with current technology and priced at today's market rates, is worth considerably more than what is under my 180 acres alone. The wooden crate on the floor contains the physical samples. Not all of them. The most significant ones. There are alexandrite specimens in that crate, Mara. Not sapphires. Alexandrite. I need you to look that word up if you don't know it. The stones in that crate are the reason Halcyon has been willing to spend 30 years waiting. I could not win this fight alone. I was the wrong person to try. An old man on a mountain with no money and no connections and a reputation they spent a long time making sure sounded like stubbornness rather than truth. I knew that. I kept fighting anyway because I could not figure out how to stop, and because stopping would have meant agreeing that what they did was acceptable, and I was not able to do that. You are not me. You are younger and you are at the beginning rather than the end, and the evidence I have assembled is better than anything I could have presented 30 years ago. Find Soren Patel. Elda will have her number. Do not go to the county. The most important thing I want to tell you is not about the land or the money. I want you to understand that what happened here was not unusual. Companies do this. They find what is valuable before the person who owns it understands what they have, and then they use every mechanism available to them to acquire it for as little as possible, or to simply wait out the person standing in the way. They do it in big ways and small ways. They do it to old men on mountains and to families in valleys, and to anyone who has something worth taking and not enough power to hold it. You have the evidence now. You have the standing. Use it not just for this land, but to make visible what was done here. Not for me. I will be past caring. But because making it visible is how you make it harder for the next time. The thing I could not figure out, the thing I need you to know, I tried to reach you. After your mother died. I tried, and the system told me it had been handled, and that disrupting your placement was not in your interest. I believed them longer than I should have. I was stubborn and proud, and I told myself I would have everything settled before I found you, that I would be able to offer you something worth the trouble of knowing. I ran out of time before I finished. I am sorry for that. I am sorry it took smoke on a January afternoon to get you to this door. But I am glad you followed it. The land is yours. What is in this room is yours. Do something with it that is worth the 30 years I spent putting it together. August Voss. She sat with the letter in her lap for a very long time. Outside, the January wind worked through the pines, low and steady, the particular sound the mountains made when they had nothing in particular to say and were simply being what they were. She thought about 12 placements. About the check for $500. About the case manager and the phrase sustainable path forward. About following a line of smoke through the trees because something in her chest pulled toward it and she'd been tired, maybe, of always choosing the sensible direction. She thought about an old man on a mountain writing letters that no one wrote back to, spending 30 years collecting evidence in numbered metal boxes and waiting for someone to come and be able to use it. She stood up. She went to the hidden room and photographed everything, every shelf and every box number and the crate on the floor and the walls and the ceiling, methodically, without hurrying, the way you approach a problem too large to solve in a single afternoon. When she was done, she closed the room, replaced the lock, folded the panel shut until it clicked. She sat back in the chair by the stove with the fire warm behind her and the photographs on her phone and the 6-page letter inside her coat. Alexandrite. Another word for her list. She would look it up tonight. She already suspected she knew what it would tell her. In the same way you can sometimes understand the shape of an answer before you have all the words for it. Thursday. Soren Patel. Everything documented. Nothing moved, nothing filed. She could do that. She fed the stove one final log, checked the damper, and walked out into the clearing. The cabin stood behind her in the fading January light, dark and patient, and full of 30 years of a man's refusal to agree that truth was only worth what power decided to pay for it. She walked back through the trees toward Old Logging Road with her hands in her pockets and the key against her palm, and the particular feeling of someone who has finally, after a long time of not knowing why they stayed somewhere, found out. The mountains held the cold around her, steady and complete, keeping their own counsel the way they always had, waiting to see what she would do next. She looked up Alexandrite on Sunday evening at the library, sitting at the terminal with her wet boots drying on the linoleum beneath her and August's letter folded in her coat pocket. Alexandrite was a chromium-bearing variety of chrysoberyl, a mineral so rare in gem quality that it had been named for a Russian czar, because the only known deposit of significance at the time of its discovery was in the Ural Mountains of Russia in 1830. Color change was its defining characteristic. Under daylight, it appeared green or teal. Under incandescent light, it shifted to red or raspberry, sometimes so dramatically it looked like two completely different stones. The geological conditions required to produce gem-quality specimens were so specific that major deposits had only been confirmed in a handful of locations worldwide: Russia, Brazil, Sri Lanka, East Africa, and according to August Voss, a ridge line in Harlan County, Montana that no one outside of Halcyon Resource Group had apparently taken seriously. She sat with that for a moment. The market price listed in the geological reference she found was not ambiguous. Top-quality Alexandrite sold for between $12,000 and $70,000 per carat, making it more expensive per carat than diamonds of comparable quality. Large stones, above 5 carats with strong color change, commanded prices that entered territory most gemstone buyers never dealt with. A single high-quality specimen of 20 carats or more could be worth more than a house, more than several houses. She looked at the photographs on her phone. The wooden crate in the hidden room, sealed, padlocked, sitting on a concrete floor in a cabin that looked from the outside like nothing particular at all. She closed the browser and sat in the library with the quiet of a Sunday evening around her and tried to understand what she'd walked into. The next morning, she was at the diner by 6. The breakfast crowd came and went. She washed plates and thought. By 10, when the rush thinned, Dell was restocking the salt shakers at the counter, and she was working through the breakfast residue on a sheet pan when he appeared in the pass-through window. "Woman out front asking for you." Mara dried her hands on the dish towel. "What woman?" "Young. Professional. Not from here." She came around to the front of the house, still holding the dish towel. The woman sitting in the corner booth was in her early 40s, dark-haired, with the compact stillness of someone who'd spent a lot of time in rooms where she needed to observe more than speak. She was dressed practically, wool coat, no jewelry to speak of, a leather briefcase on the seat beside her that looked like it had been used hard and kept well. Mara Voss. She didn't stand, just turned in the booth. "I'm Soren Patel. I moved my schedule. I drove up from Billings this morning." Mara sat across from her. "You said Thursday." "I said Thursday because I didn't know what you had. After we spoke, I made some calls." Soren's voice was precise and level. David Aurelius confirmed that August's documentation was more complete than I'd understood. And a contact at the county clerk's office, one I trust, told me an inquiry about the Voss parcel came through the office Friday afternoon from a law firm in Billings that represents Halcyon Resource Group. That was faster than Elda thought. It usually is. Soren pulled a yellow legal pad from the briefcase. "They know you're here. What they don't know yet is whether you've been into the property or found the documentation. That window is small and getting smaller. Tell me exactly what you've seen and touched." Mara told her. All of it, in the order it happened, keeping her voice low and steady. The smoke, the cabin, the 2 notes, the tin box and its contents, the meeting with Elda, the hidden room, the numbered metal boxes, and the sealed wooden crate. August's letter. Soren wrote while she talked, her pen moving quickly, abbreviating, noting. When Mara finished, Soren set the pen down and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not excited but was very alert. "You said Alexandrite. August's letter names it specifically, and you haven't opened the crate." "No. I photographed everything exactly as it was. I didn't move anything." Soren picked up the pen again. "Good. That matters. Chain of custody matters in ways that will become important when this goes to court." She began writing again, faster. "Here's what I need you to understand about where you stand. You have 3 separate categories of claim, and they're not equal in complexity or risk. The first is straightforward inheritance. The 180-acre parcel passed to you as sole heir upon August's death. There was no will filed, which slows the process, but the chain of title is clean. I can file the probate paperwork today and have a preliminary order establishing your ownership within 2 weeks. Halcyon will contest it. They'll try, but they have no legal standing. They have no deed, no recorded interest, nothing that would give a court reason to delay your inheritance. Their play will be to tie you up in procedural challenges while they look for a foothold. Soren's voice carried no particular alarm about this, just information. The second category is mineral rights. Under Virginia law, mineral rights can be severed from surface rights, but in Montana the default is unified ownership unless there's a recorded severance. There is none on this parcel. Your mineral rights are yours. And the third is what's in that crate and those boxes. Soren put the pen down again. If August documented evidence of a commercial alexandrite deposit extending across the ridge onto adjacent federal land, and if that documentation is credible and the physical samples authenticate, then what you have is not just a mineral rights case. It's a federal claim. Extraction rights on federal land require specific permits under the General Mining Act. If Halcyon has been operating or planning to operate on that adjacent acreage based on geological data obtained from unauthorized access to your family's property, you have a civil fraud claim against them and potentially a basis for a federal complaint. Mara looked at the table. What is all of that worth? The 180 acres, at current Montana Sapphire valuations for a deposit this size, conservatively between $200 and $250 million. Soren's tone didn't change for the number. The alexandrite, if the specimens are what August believed them to be, I can't give you a figure without a gemologist's assessment. But the market for high-quality alexandrite is not small. The federal land claim, if proven, that depends on what the deposit surveys show, but additional hundreds of millions is not an unreasonable expectation. Dell was watching them from behind the counter with the expression of a man pretending not to. I need to see the cabin, Soren said. Today, if possible. I want to photograph everything independently, and I want to get a geologist out there before Halcyon files any kind of petition that could give them access to the property. You can get a geologist here quickly? I've already called one. Soren picked up her coffee mug. Priya Sinha. She's on the faculty at Montana State. Her specialty is mineral deposit formation in the northern Rocky formations. She's driven here before for field work. I reached her this morning. She can be here by Wednesday if I give her a confirmed address. Mara thought about the weight of the sealed crate on the concrete floor, the numbered boxes on the shelves. 30 years of a man's meticulous work waiting in the cold. I'll take you this afternoon. They drove out separately and parked on different roads, meeting at the east tree line with the cabin visible across the clearing. Soren moved through the space with a practiced economy, not touching anything, just looking first, building the picture before she documented it. She photographed the entire main room in a systematic grid pattern, moving left to right and floor to ceiling, before she opened the tin box or touched the papers on the workbench. The hidden room she photographed for 20 minutes straight. When she came back to the main room and sat at the workbench stool, she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone processing something larger than they'd expected. He built this system over decades, she said. 30 years, from the letters. The numbered boxes are site documentation, most likely. Separate samples from separate locations, dated and logged, so you can cross-reference the physical evidence with the survey records. Soren turned slowly on the stool, looking at the shelves. This is the work of someone who understood that evidence degrades unless it's managed. He treated this like a legal case file. A pause. He would have won in court with documentation this thorough if he'd had the resources to fight on those terms. He didn't. No. Soren's voice was straightforward about it. He didn't, and they knew he didn't, and that was the calculation they made. It's the same calculation they always make. The value of what they want minus the cost of taking it from someone who can't afford to stop them. She stood. We need to open the crate before Wednesday. I want Priya's eyes on those specimens before I file anything, because the moment I file, Halcyon will know the scope of what we're claiming and they will move hard. The staples on the crate came out with a flat bar from the workbench tools. They worked carefully, Mara holding the bar while Soren photographed each stage of the opening, documenting the seal before it was broken, the staple positions, the lid condition. When the lid came off, they both went still. The interior was padded with layers of dense foam, cut to fit, the kind of custom packing used for scientific or geological equipment. Set into the foam in individual cutouts were stones. Not the rough, uneven chunks Mara had pictured. These were cleaner than that, shaped by careful extraction, some of them showing crystal structure on their faces, the natural geometry of the mineral before cutting. They ranged in size from about a thumb's width to one specimen near the center of the crate that was considerably larger, the size of a large man's fist, its surface showing the distinctive waxy luster of chrysoberyl. Soren was photographing steadily. Mara crouched beside the crate and looked at the stones. In the daylight coming through the cabin's single window, the large central specimen was green, a complex green, not uniform, but layered and deep, the color shifting as the angle of the light changed. She moved slightly, letting the angle change further. The green pulled toward teal, then toward something that was almost gray-blue, then back. She turned on the flashlight on her phone and held it close. Under the warmer, incandescent approximating light, the stone changed. The green retreated. In its place came a deep raspberry red, not uniform either, but concentrated in the stone's interior and radiating outward toward the edges, fading as it went. The effect was immediate and startling. She moved the light away and the green came back. She heard herself exhale. Soren lowered the camera. She was looking at the stone the way a person looks at something they've read about but never seen, with the particular attention of recognition. "That's a significant specimen," Soren said. "How significant? I'm a lawyer, not a gemologist." But the way she said it acknowledged that she knew what she was looking at. The color change is strong. The size is exceptional. Gem-quality alexandrite of that size with strong color change is effectively without ceiling on the private market. She started photographing again. There are 47 stones in this crate by my count. Most of them small, 1 to 5 carats rough estimate, which puts them in the range of accessible market value. The central specimen is different. If I had to put a rough number on it based on what I know about the market, she stopped. Say it. The large specimen alone, if authenticated, cut, and brought to market through the right channels, could be worth between $8 and $15 million. Soren's voice was careful with the number, treating it the way you'd treat something fragile. The rest of the crate, depending on quality assessments, adds considerably more. And that is before we talk about what else is up here in the ground. Mara sat back on her heels on the concrete floor of the hidden room and looked at the stones August Voss had spent 30 years collecting and hiding and protecting and never got to see turned into anything. "He knew," she said. "He knew." Soren closed the camera case. He also knew that knowing wasn't enough. You can't walk into a bank or a courtroom with a box of rocks and a handwritten survey and expect anyone with power to take you seriously. He needed the legal infrastructure around the evidence. He didn't have the money to build it. And Halcyon knew he knew. They knew what he had because they'd surveyed it themselves first. When he started pushing back in 1991, they understood the threat. Their strategy was containment. Make it expensive for him, drag it out, discredit him where possible, and wait. Soren stood, replacing the foam lid carefully. They waited him out, but they made one significant error. He documented everything. He documented everything, Soren confirmed. And he had a granddaughter. They resealed the crate as best they could and replaced it exactly as it had been. Soren photographed the room one final time from the doorway before Mara locked the padlock and pressed the panel closed. Outside, the Monday light was flat and cold, the sky threatening more snow. They stood in the clearing for a moment before walking back to their separate vehicles. "I need 2 days," Soren said. "I want Priya to see the specimens and the survey documentation before I file anything. I'll drive back to Billings tonight, prepare the paperwork, and be back Wednesday with her. Can you keep this quiet until then?" "Elda knows. Francis Medler knows. I'll call Elda tonight. Medler I want to speak with before he talks to anyone else." Soren pulled on her gloves. "In the meantime, if Halcyon's representative makes contact with you directly, which they will, do not engage. Do not confirm or deny anything. Take a name, ask for a business card, and call me immediately." "What will they offer?" Soren looked at her steadily. "More than they offered August. Probably significantly more, because they know the stakes have changed. Whatever number they say, the real number is what we have in that room, and the real number is why they've been at this for 30 years. She started for the tree line. Don't be tempted by the first thing they put in front of you. They're good at making numbers sound like the end of an argument when they're actually the beginning of one. Mara walked back alone through the January trees, the red cloth markers flashing faint color against the white of the snow, and thought about numbers. About the difference between $214 and whatever was in that crate. She'd spent enough time in the specific poverty of being young and without family to know that money was not abstract, that it represented time and warmth and the absence of certain fears. She understood why someone in her position would take the first offer they received and feel relief and not blame themselves for it. She also understood, standing in the trees with the cold around her and August's letter against her chest, that taking that offer would mean agreeing to be quiet about 30 years of deliberate theft, and she wasn't sure she was built for that kind of agreement. Elda called Tuesday morning before Mara's shift. Short and direct, no wasted words. They sent someone to the diner. He arrived at 8, sat at the counter, asked Dell if a young woman named Voss had been working there. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. Dell knows my name. Dell told him you worked there, that you'd been working there for months, probably trying to be helpful. The man left without ordering anything. Elda's voice was even. Soren says to expect a direct approach. Don't be at the diner this afternoon if you can manage it. She asked Dell for the afternoon off, claiming a migraine, which he accepted without question, and she spent the afternoon at the library working through the numbered box labels she'd photographed, cross-referencing them against the survey documentation in August's folder. The system August had built was cleaner than she'd expected. Each box corresponded to a specific drill site marked on the amended survey, numbered sequentially in the order he'd sampled them, dated on the label. Sites 1 through 14 were on his 180 acres. Sites 15 through 37 extended beyond his property line, northeast, onto the adjacent federal classification. Each of the 37 sites had photographic documentation folded inside the box with the sample, she assumed, and assay reports he'd paid for privately. 37 sites, documented over almost 3 decades, a few per year, patient as geology. She thought about what that took. The discipline of it, the refusal to stop when stopping would have been the natural response to every obstacle that came at him. She'd met people in the foster system who'd fought for things, some of them, not many, and the ones who'd kept fighting longest all had something in common she'd never been able to name exactly. Not toughness, which was a word that meant not feeling things. Something more like the belief that the fight itself was worth something independent of whether you won. August had believed that. She was still working through the documents when a man sat down across the table from her. She hadn't heard him come in. He'd moved quietly and chosen the chair opposite hers, on the other side of the reading table, with the practiced ease of someone used to entering spaces without announcing themselves. He was mid-50s, well-dressed in the understated way of serious money, a dark wool coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Clean-shaved, silver at the temples, with eyes that were attentive and professionally neutral. Ms. Voss. He set a business card on the table between them. My name is Reed Calder. I'm the regional director for Halcyon Resource Group. I was hoping we could have a conversation. Mara placed her hand over the documents she'd been reading and looked at him. I'm going to take your card and call my lawyer, she said. Of course. His voice was pleasant. Though I'd ask you to hear 2 sentences first, given that lawyers have a way of turning 2 sentences into 2 years. He waited, taking her silence as permission. Your grandfather was offered fair market value for the mineral rights on his property multiple times over 30 years. He chose not to accept. We understand that, and we bear no ill will toward his decision. But the situation has changed with his passing. What I'd like to discuss is a fresh offer, made without the history between him and our company, that I think you'll find very reasonable given your current circumstances. I'll have my lawyer call you, Mara said. She'll advise you to hold out for more money. Calder's tone stayed pleasant, like someone explaining a simple procedure. That's her job. But more money means more time, and more time means more uncertainty. I've seen your financial records, Ms. Voss. The shelter, the wages from this diner. A clean settlement now, without litigation, could be considerably more than that. He slid a second card across the table. This one has a figure on the back. It's not our ceiling, but it's serious, and it's available in the next 10 days. After that, the process moves into legal channels that benefit no one. She didn't look at the card. I'll have my lawyer call you. He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something very brief and very controlled move through his expression before the pleasantness returned over it. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and walked out of the library without looking back. She turned the card over. $300,000. She put the card in her coat pocket and spent the rest of the afternoon at the library. She didn't look at the number again, but she sat with the awareness of it in her pocket, the specific weight of a sum that was enormous relative to her and trivial relative to what she was holding, and she thought about the careful engineering of the offer. The timing of it, the mention of her financial records, the word reasonable used like a mirror angled to make her feel unreasonable for refusing. It was the same structure as the letters in August's folder, the same tactic refined over 3 decades, made more precise by practice. She called Soren from the payphone, left a voicemail describing the interaction in detail. Calder's name, his approach, the figure on the card. Soren called back in 20 minutes. $300,000 is an 1,800% increase from their last offer to August. Her voice was tight in a way it hadn't been before. That tells us 2 things. First, they've assessed what you likely found, and they're scared. Second, they're moving faster than I expected, which means we need to move faster too. A pause. I'm driving up tonight instead of Wednesday. Priya can be in Harlan by noon tomorrow. Don't go back to the cabin before I'm there. Understood. And Mara, don't tell anyone at the shelter about any of this. Not a name, not a detail, not a hint. Your physical safety matters right now as much as the legal strategy. She walked back to Cedar Ridge in the dark. The cold was full and complete, a clear January night with stars visible above the town's light wash, the kind of sky that made everything feel very still and very exposed. She thought about August writing his letters for 30 years in a cabin in the woods, alone, getting the same bureaucratic non-answers, watching the company raise its offers every few years in increments designed to seem generous while staying far below anything honest. She thought about him dying in July with the fight still open and the crate still sealed and no one to carry it. She had been told she had no family. That had been wrong in the way institutions were sometimes wrong, not from malice but from indifference, from the ease of closing a file and moving on. August had been real. The fight was real. The crate full of stones that changed color like something from a story was real, locked in a room behind a paneled wall in a frozen cabin in the Montana mountains. She went to sleep thinking about Theory 7 drill sites and a deposit that didn't stop at the property line. Soren arrived at Elda's house by 10 the following morning, bringing with her a woman she introduced as Priya Sinha, 33 years old, compact and bright-eyed, wearing field gear that had been used in actual fields, not bought for the occasion. Priya had a canvas bag over her shoulder that clinked faintly when she moved. Tools, she said, when she caught Mara noticing. Loops, field spectrometer, sample containers, reference cards. I want to see the stones before anything else. They drove in convoy out to Old Logging Road, parked in 3 separate locations the way Soren had arranged, and walked to the cabin from different directions. Soren had not been this way before in darkness, and Mara watched her move through the trees with the careful competence of someone who understood that preparation was not preparation if it stopped when things got uncomfortable. Priya stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin for a moment before crossing to it. How old? 1940s, from the deed, Mara said. The chinking on the west side is more recent. 40 years, maybe. He kept it up. She said it with the respect of someone who understood what it took to maintain a structure in a Montana winter. Inside, Priya went directly to the hidden room without being directed. She'd been briefed by Soren on the drive up, and she moved through the space with the focused attention of someone who had been thinking about what she was about to see since Soren had called her 2 days ago. She took 20 minutes examining the numbered boxes without opening any of them, reading the labels, cross-referencing them against the survey photographs on her phone, making small sounds that expressed nothing except active thought. Then she crouched beside the crate. Mara lifted the lid. The stones in the foam. The central specimen at the center of the arrangement, the large one, sitting in its cutout with the slightly waxy luster of chrysoberyl visible even in the cabin's interior light. Priya reached into her canvas bag without looking at it, and came out with a small loop, the kind jewelers and gemologists used. She picked up the large central specimen with gloved hands and held it to the light. The silence in the hidden room lasted a long time. Priya turned the stone slowly under the loop. She rotated it. She set down the loop and took out a small device, the field spectrometer, and held it against the stone's surface, watching the reading. Then she held the stone under the flashlight on her phone, where the green pulled toward that deep raspberry red. When she put the stone back in the foam, she sat back on her heels and was quiet for a moment. Where did he find these? Her voice had acquired a quality Mara hadn't heard in it before. On the property. Over about 30 years. Rough extracted. He knew what he was doing with the sampling, whoever taught him. She looked at the other stones in the crate without touching them yet. The large specimen is chrome-rich chrysoberyl with alexandrite effect. Strong color change. The inclusions I can see under the loop are consistent with northeastern Montana geology. The spectrometer reading matches alexandrite chemical signature. She looked up. The color change on this stone is exceptional. I mean that in a technical sense. The green to red shift is complete, and even in the color saturation in both states is high. This is not common. How uncommon? Alexandrite with color change this strong above 5 carats is rare enough that major specimens get named and tracked in the trade. Priya held the stone up to the window one more time. This stone is well above 5 carats rough. Cutting it properly, you'd likely produce a primary stone of 15 to 20 carats and several smaller calibrated stones from the rough. At current auction prices for alexandrite of this quality, she set it back down carefully. I don't want to give you a number without a proper gemological assessment. What I can tell you is that this stone would generate serious interest from the major auction houses. Christie's, Sotheby's. The kind of interest that comes with competitive bidding. Can you give me a range? Priya looked at Soren, then back at Mara. Primary stone alone, if cut correctly and authenticated, $8 to $20 million depending on the auction result. That range is not in precision. That's the actual range for stones of this quality. The market for exceptional alexandrite is thin and unpredictable at the top end. She gestured at the rest of the crate. The remaining 46 specimens are smaller. Some of them are significant in their own right. 3 or 4 of the mid-size pieces show color change that in a less dramatic specimen would be considered the main event. She began photographing them individually with a small reference scale. The full crate, professionally assessed and brought to market, is a substantial sum. How substantial? Soren said. Priya didn't look up from the camera. $40 to $80 million across all specimens. That range assumes proper authentication, cutting, and access to international auction markets. It assumes nothing goes wrong. Mara stood in the doorway of the hidden room and looked at the numbered metal boxes on the shelves. 37 sites. 37 locations where August had gone, quietly, over decades, and taken samples and run assays, and built his case one box at a time. I need to look at the geological documentation, Priya said. She had begun moving along the shelves, reading box labels. If he marked sites beyond the property boundary, I want to run the coordinates against the Federal Land Survey maps. That's the piece I can't assess from the physical samples alone. He has assay reports in the boxes, Mara said. He documented the analysis separately from the samples. Priya turned and looked at her. He ran independent assays on field samples from 37 sites. 1 or 2 a year from the dates on the labels. Over about 25 years. Priya stopped. That's a complete data set. For a deposit this size, that's the kind of systematic documentation that takes funded research projects years to build. She said it without inflection, just the weight of understanding something clearly. They spent 2 hours in the cabin, the 3 of them working through the material in the numbered boxes. Priya reading assay reports and cross-referencing them against the survey coordinates, making notes in her own field journal. Soren documenting the chain of custody on each item. Photographing, numbering, creating an index that would hold up to challenge. Mara managing the materials, handing things across, keeping track of what had been opened and closed and in what order. The assay reports from the 23 boxes covering federal land were the key document. August had them analyzed by 3 separate independent geological labs, the same samples sent to different labs for comparison, specifically to defeat any argument about single-source bias. Each lab had returned consistent results, corundum deposits of commercial quality, with alexandrite indicators, in a formation that ran continuous across the ridge. The federal land deposit, Priya said, sitting on the floor with the reports spread around her. If these assay results hold under current survey methodology, You're looking at a deposit approximately 4 times the size of what's under the 180 acres. 4 times. Soren was writing steadily. She didn't look up. What does that translate to in commercial value? At current prices, conservatively, $800 million to over $1 billion in combined mineral value, extractable over a generation-length operation. Priya said it the way you say something that sounds implausible but happens to be true. The bulk of it would be sapphire-grade corundum, which drives the large number. The alexandrite component is smaller in total volume, but represents a disproportionate share of the per-carat value. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the January wind had picked up slightly, pressing against the walls. August's claim on the federal deposit, Soren said, and her voice was different now, the voice of someone building an argument in real time. Under the General Mining Act, a private claimant can establish locatable mineral rights on federal land through discovery and valid location. But that requires actual discovery and legal staking. August never filed a claim. He couldn't file without exposing what he had and giving Halcyon the information to move against him, Mara said. Correct. But he documented the discovery extensively, which is the first requirement. He also documented that Halcyon accessed the geological information from his property without permission and used that information to file their own federal exploration permits. Soren pulled out a folder. I have those permit filings. David Aurelius obtained copies before he retired and included them in the package he sent me. Halcyon filed for exploration rights on the adjacent federal parcel in 2003. The geological data referenced in their application is derived from survey work on the Voss parcel. They used August's deposit data to file for rights on the land next door, Priya said slowly. They took the information that told them where the resource was and then filed for rights to the resource on the land they could access legally, while blocking him from filing for the land they couldn't acquire. Soren looked at Mara. That is fraud. Documented, specific, provable fraud, and it gives you a basis for a civil claim against their federal permits as well as the direct civil claim on the mineral rights. What does that mean for the total value of the claim? Soren put her pen down. She had the quality, in that moment, of someone who had been working toward a number for a long time and had arrived at it. The 180 acres, 200 to 250 million in mineral rights. The alexandrite specimens from the crate, 40 to 80 million, depending on auction results. The federal land claim. If we can successfully challenge Halcyon's permits and establish derivation from your family's property, that is where the numbers become very large. Damages from fraudulent use of proprietary geological data, combined with injunctive relief and a legitimate competing claim on the federal permits, could exceed the value of the deposit itself. A pause. We are potentially talking about a total claim approaching $400 million, and that number is conservative. Mara leaned against the door frame of the hidden room. She looked at August's life's work in numbered boxes on concrete shelves, in stones wrapped in foam, in 30 years of letters and assay reports and refused offers and stubborn, costly, ultimately insufficient refusal to agree that what was his could be taken from him. He died not knowing, she said. He died not knowing if anyone would come. Soren corrected quietly. He knew what he had. He built the case for it. He just didn't know whether it would matter. Priya was already packing her canvas bag with the care of someone returning expensive tools. I can have a preliminary written assessment of the physical specimens to you by Friday. That, combined with the survey documentation and the assay reports, gives you the scientific foundation for the legal claim. She closed the bag. You should file quickly. Thursday, Soren said. Federal District Court in Billings. I'll file the civil complaint against Halcyon and simultaneously petition for a preliminary injunction preventing them from any further activity on the adjacent federal parcel pending resolution. She looked at Mara. Once I file, this becomes public. The press will pick it up, probably within a day or two. You should be prepared for that. Mara thought about the woman at the library computer terminal who had never expected to find her own name in a Montana cabin, who had $214 and a dishwashing job and a cot in a shelter. She thought about what it meant to be prepared. I'm already prepared, she said. I've been invisible for a long time. Being visible is not the hard thing. They closed the hidden room, replaced the locks, folded the panel closed. Soren sealed her documentation in a hard case that she kept with her at all times. Priya's canvas bag went into the back of her vehicle under a locked compartment. They left the cabin the way they'd found it. The fire banked low, the door pulled closed. The clearing was still and white around them in the afternoon light. Walking back through the trees, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not safety, which was probably not coming soon. Not certainty. Something closer to being positioned correctly in relation to something true. She called Francis Medler that evening from Elda's kitchen. Elda had his number written on a card in her kitchen drawer, the card's edges soft from handling. The phone rang twice before a man answered, voice cautious, the caution of someone who had lived with a secret long enough that answering the phone had become an exercise in assessment. Mr. Medler, Mara said. My name is Mara Voss. You left a note for me. A silence. Then, I've been waiting for this call for 14 months. His voice when he relaxed out of the caution was an older man's voice, dry and careful, Montana in the vowels. He told her he'd been a state land assessor for the Department of Natural Resources for 29 years, covering the northeastern counties, including Harlan. In 1993, he had been asked to review a permit application from Rocky Mountain Resource Development, the predecessor entity to Halcyon, for exploratory drilling on federal land in the northeast quadrant of the county. The application had been routine in most respects. But one piece of geological data attached to the permit, a seismic survey showing subsurface formation patterns, had looked familiar to him in a way he couldn't immediately place. He'd filed it and gone home and thought about it for a week before he remembered where he'd seen the formation pattern before. On a private geological study he'd reviewed 2 years earlier as part of a standard land assessment for the Voss property. The formation pattern in Halcyon's permit application was consistent with data derived from the Voss parcel. I flagged it, Medler said. I wrote an internal note questioning the source data and sent it to my supervisor. What happened? My supervisor told me the permit data had been reviewed and verified by a state geologist whose name I didn't recognize, and that I should process the application as submitted. A pause. 2 weeks later, the same supervisor called me into his office and suggested I'd misremembered seeing the formation pattern on the Voss assessment. Suggested I was confusing 2 separate documents. I had the original assessment notes, but they weren't in the official file anymore. Someone had pulled them. Mara held the phone. I processed the permit, Medler said. I told myself I was wrong about what I'd seen. I had a family and a pension, and I told myself it was a coincidence. He was quiet for a moment. August Sullivan came to see me in 1995. He'd heard I'd flagged something in the permit review. He wanted to know what I'd seen. I told him I'd been mistaken. I watched him leave my office knowing he was going to keep fighting alone, and I did nothing. Why are you doing this now? Because August died, and because I'm 71 and my pension is secure and the cost of doing nothing has become heavier than the cost of doing something. He said it without drama. I have a signed statement prepared by a notary in Billings, describing everything I just told you in the detail required to be useful in court. I have a copy of the internal flagging note I wrote in 1993, the original, which I took home that day and kept. A pause. I think I always knew I'd need it eventually. I've been carrying it in my house for 30 years. Mara thought about the weight of 30 years of guilt, about the specific way it moved through a life, the things it cost. I'll have my lawyer call you about the statement, she said. She already has my number. I spoke with Soren Patel yesterday evening. He was the third person, after Elda and David Aurelius, who had been preparing for this moment before it arrived. 3 people who had believed August and carried pieces of his case forward without knowing if anyone would ever pick them up. She thanked him and hung up. Elda was at the stove, her back to the conversation, making tea with the focused attention she brought to everything. She set a mug down in front of Mara without comment. He was braver than he thought he was, Mara said. Most people are. Elda sat. They just don't find out until it counts. Soren filed the complaint on Thursday morning at 8:15, Federal District Court in Billings, a civil action naming Halcyon Resource Group as defendant on counts of fraudulent misrepresentation, unauthorized use of proprietary geological data, and civil fraud in connection with federal permit applications. Simultaneously, she filed for a preliminary injunction halting any Halcyon operations on the adjacent federal land pending resolution of the core dispute. By noon, the court had granted a temporary stay on Halcyon's federal land activities pending a hearing. By 2, A reporter from the Billings Gazette had called Soren's office. By 5, the regional AP wire had picked up the story. Orphan girl inherits Montana land. Sues energy company over $400 million mineral fraud. The headline was rough and the details were incomplete, but the shape of it was there, spreading outward across the news cycle with the particular momentum of a story that combined money and injustice and a protagonist nobody had expected. Soren called Mara at 6:15. Her voice, for the first time since they'd met, carried something close to satisfaction, not triumph, but the feeling of a machine beginning to move after a long time standing still. The injunction was faster than I expected. The judge reviewed the preliminary evidence and determined there was sufficient basis to halt Halcyon's operations while we established the core claim. That hurts them immediately. They have a drilling operation plan for the federal land that is now frozen. A pause. They know what that means. We'll hear from their lawyers by morning. What will they say? They'll file a motion to dissolve the injunction. They'll argue we haven't established ownership of the underlying data, that August's survey methodology was flawed, that the chain of custody on the physical evidence is insufficient. All standard challenges. We'll oppose every one. How long until a hearing? The injunction hearing is in 3 weeks. That's where the preliminary fight will happen. But Mara, between now and then, things will get loud. I know. The $300,000 offer from Calder is already obsolete. Their exposure is too large. They'll come back with a settlement number that's meant to be too big to refuse. Soren's voice was measured. I want you to hear that number when it comes and not panic and not agree to anything without talking to me first. The number will be large. It will also be significantly less than what we can take from them in court. What's the difference? Any settlement will include a confidentiality agreement. You'd receive the money and you would never be able to say publicly what Halcyon did, what they did to August, what they took from your family and from the community of people who might have been watching the same thing happen to them. Soren paused. That's what you have to decide, whether the money alone is enough or whether the public account matters. Mara sat on the edge of the cot in the shelter, in the quiet of a Wednesday evening, the other women around her going through the ordinary motions of shelter life, and thought about August writing letters in the woods alone for 30 years, fighting something that only he could see from where he stood. She thought about what it would mean to settle, to take the money, whatever the number was, and sign an agreement that committed her to silence. She would be comfortable. She would be more than comfortable. Sophie, if she'd had a Sophie, would never want for anything. She could become invisible again in a different way, invisible by choice rather than circumstance, cushioned and quiet, and forever separate from what had been done here. She thought about the numbered boxes on the shelves. The 30 years of meticulous, underpaid, unrecognized work. The letters that got form letter responses. The offer of $85,000 made 4 months before a man died at 71, having never seen any of it count for anything. They can keep their confidentiality agreement, she said. I want the public account. Soren was quiet for a moment. Then, okay, then we fight. The call from Reed Calder came Friday morning, to the payphone at the library at 9 sharp, which meant he'd been watching her routine and knew where she'd be. She answered without knowing who it was. Ms. Voss. His voice was the same as in the library, pleasant, smooth, the quality of professional courtesy that had been practiced until it became instinct. I apologize for the early call. I imagine the last 48 hours have been eventful. I'll give you 30 seconds, she said. Then I'll be efficient. A pause. $1.5 million. Cash settlement, clean title transfer, full mineral rights conveyance. Your lawyer gets a 10% bonus fee. You walk away with enough to never think about any of this again. The number dropped into the cold morning like a stone into still water. She watched a pickup truck back slowly out of a parking space across the street. My lawyer will call you, she said. Mara, the pleasantness shifted slightly. I want to be honest with you about something. This litigation will take years. It will require your constant attention and presence. It will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees, which your attorney is fronting, but which create a debt that shapes every decision you make. And there is a real possibility, not a certainty, but a real one, that after 3 years of your life and enormous stress and public scrutiny of every detail of your history, you will win something less than what you're turning down right now. Everything you just said is true, Mara said. It's also everything they said to my grandfather every year for 30 years. I'll have my lawyer call you." She hung up. She stood at the payphone in the January cold and breathed out slowly, watching her breath dissolve into the still air. $1.5 million. She turned it over in her mind with the same careful attention she'd been bringing to all of it, not flinching, not pretending the number didn't matter, because it did matter. It mattered enormously. It was more money than she had a real intuitive scale for. She also understood that it was the third offer in a week from a company that had been willing to spend 30 years and untold legal fees to avoid paying August Voss $22,000 for the same thing. The escalation was not generosity. It was a measure of what they stood to lose. She called Soren and described the conversation. "Good." Soren's voice was entirely without surprise. "I expected something in that range. Their exposure calculation is shifting now that the federal injunction is in place. Every day the federal land operations are frozen costs them money on existing contracts." A brief pause. "They'll go higher. Whatever they offer next will be designed to feel like the final, absolute limit." "It won't be." "How high can we push them?" "To where it hurts enough that paying us costs less than losing in court." Soren was typing while she talked. Mara could hear it. "The injunction hearing is in 3 weeks. If the judge upholds the injunction, Halcyon's project timeline collapses. They'll have investors and contract obligations that become very expensive to delay further. That's our leverage point. What do we need for the hearing?" "Priya's written assessment of the specimens and the survey data. Medler's signed statement. The chain of title documentation. Expert testimony on the geological connection between August's data and Halcyon's permit application." She paused. "And you'll need to testify. Brief, focused, factual. What you found, in what order, in what condition. Nothing interpretive. Just what you saw." Mara looked at the street. At Harlan going about its ordinary business in the ordinary January light. "I can do that. I know you can." Soren's typing stopped. "One more thing. The press coverage. The AP story was picked up nationally overnight. There are 3 interview requests in my office from outlets I describe as serious. I think you should consider talking to one of them." "Why?" "Because Halcyon's other strategy, the one they'll pursue parallel to the legal fight, is to make this about an opportunistic young woman exploiting her grandfather's memory for a windfall. They'll brief sympathetic press. They'll paint you as someone who showed up with nothing, found a complicated situation, and saw a payday." A pause. "You need to be on record, in your own voice, before they define you. Not your whole story. Just enough to establish who you actually are." Mara thought about 12 placements. About $214. About a case manager using the words sustainable path forward in a voice that expected nothing of her. "Which outlet?" "The one that sent the best journalist." A beat. "I'll set it up for Monday. Keep the weekend clear, stay out of sight, and do not under any circumstances speak with anyone from Halcyon or their representatives between now and then." That night, alone in the shelter after lights out, Mara lay on her cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was carrying. Not the money, not the legal strategy, not the injunction or the specimens in the hidden room. The other thing. The thing that had been building since she'd stood in the clearing and pushed open a door in the cold. She was fighting something that had run a calculation on her grandfather and decided he was small enough to absorb. A calculation that factored in his age and his isolation and his lack of resources, and decided those things added up to someone who would eventually give up or give out. They'd been right about the giving out. He died. They'd been wrong about the giving up. In the wooden crate in the hidden room, 47 stones that changed color depending on the light, because the world looked different depending on where you stood to examine it. Green in daylight, red under different conditions. The same object showing 2 completely different faces, both of them real, both of them true, neither of them the whole picture from any single position. She thought about August, standing on his land in 1991, finding the first stone and understanding what he was looking at, and then understanding what it meant that the company had already found it first. He must have known then. Known that he was at the beginning of something very long and very hard, and he'd built the fire in the stove and gone out the next morning and started building his case anyway. 1 box at a time, 1 assay report at a time, 1 letter at a time, into the void of institutional indifference. The fight had cost him everything except the fight itself. She was going to make sure it cost him something else instead. She closed her eyes, and the mountains were still outside the shelter windows, holding the cold and the dark and the patience of things that had been there a very long time and intended to stay. 3 weeks to the injunction hearing. She had work to do. The 3 weeks before the injunction hearing moved the way time moves when consequences close, too fast in some hours and unbearably slow in others. The days shaped by preparation and waiting in alternating layers. Soren drove up from Billings twice in that period. She and Mara worked at Elda's kitchen table for hours at a stretch, building the case into something precise enough to withstand expert challenge. Priya Sinha submitted her written assessment on the Friday following their cabin visit, 14 pages of technical analysis that authenticated the alexandrite specimens, confirmed the geological consistency of the survey data with the Voss parcel, and documented the continuous formation pattern extending northeast across the ridge. The report was peer-reviewed by a second Montana State faculty member over the weekend, who confirmed Priya's findings with only minor adjustments to the phrasing of 2 technical conclusions. Francis Medler's signed statement arrived the following Monday by certified mail from Billings, 10 pages in careful legal language that described, in precise technical detail, what he had seen in 1993 and what had been done to make sure he stopped seeing it. He had attached the original internal flagging note, 30 years old, the paper slightly yellowed, his handwriting clear and specific in the margins. He'd kept it in a manila envelope in the bottom drawer of his desk for 3 decades. There was something about that detail, the specific choice of where to keep it, that Mara thought about more than once. Halcyon's lawyers filed 3 separate motions in the first 10 days. A motion to dissolve the preliminary injunction, a motion to dismiss the federal fraud claims on the grounds of insufficient particularity, and a motion to challenge the admissibility of the geological evidence on chain of custody grounds. Each filing was several 100 pages long, dense with precedent citations and technical objections, the legal equivalent of filling a room with furniture so there was no space left to stand. Soren's oppositions were shorter, cleaner, and considerably more pointed. The judge set oral argument for the injunction motion on the same date as the original hearing. The press interview happened on the Monday of the second week. The journalist Soren had selected was a woman named Elda Marsh, no relation to Elda, from the Minneapolis Tribune, which had picked up the AP story and sent her west within 48 hours. She was in her mid-40s, sharp and unhurried, with the particular listening quality of someone who had learned that the most important information in an interview was usually the thing the subject said in the 3rd hour when they'd stopped performing and were just talking. They met at Elda's house. Mara had thought about what to say and then decided not to think about it too hard, because everything she'd learned about the difference between truth and strategy was that strategy required you to know in advance what you were protecting, and she wasn't protecting anything except the simple shape of what had happened. She told Caroline the story from the beginning. The shelter, the smoke, the note on the doorstep with her name on it, August's letters, unanswered, the stones in the foam-padded crate, the geological data spread across 37 numbered metal boxes in a hidden room in a frozen cabin in the Montana mountains, assembled over 30 years by a man who had been told, by lawyers and county officials and form letter bureaucracies, that he was confused about what he owned. Caroline asked good questions. She asked about the foster care system, about what it meant to age out at 19 with $500 and a folder of pamphlets. She asked what Mara had felt, standing in the hidden room the first time, looking at what August had built. She asked whether Mara was angry. Mara thought about that one for a moment. Not the way you mean, she said. I'm not angry at a person exactly. I'm angry at a calculation. The calculation that someone small can be waited out, that someone without resources will eventually get tired or get desperate enough to take whatever they're offered, and that the waiting will cost less than the honesty. That calculation was made about my grandfather, and it was made about me, and I'm angry that it's a calculation companies make routinely, because usually they're right. Are they right this time? Caroline said. Ask me after the hearing. The story ran on Thursday, 3 days before the injunction hearing, under a headline that was restrained and specific. Orphan inherits Montana land, files suit challenging decades of alleged mineral fraud. The subheadline was less restrained. An energy company, $400 million in disputed assets, and a dead man's hidden evidence. By Friday evening, the story had been picked up by 47 outlets. By Saturday, It had crossed into international press, the UK broadsheets, and 2 European financial publications, all of them interested in the specific shape of the legal theory, the idea that proprietary geological data could be fraudulently appropriated and used to file federal land permits, which had implications in mineral rights law that extended well beyond one parcel in Montana. Soren called Saturday afternoon. Her voice was the voice of someone containing something. 3 things. First, 2 additional reporters want interviews for next week. Second, Halcyon has filed a 4th motion, this one a defamation claim against you personally for statements in the Tribune article. It's frivolous and we'll counter it, but they're trying to add to your legal burden. A pause. Third, they've offered $5 million. The number had jumped more than 3-fold from the prior offer, which told its own story. No confidentiality agreement, Mara said. The offer includes a standard NDA. You'd be prevented from discussing the case publicly after settlement. No. Soren was quiet for a beat. I want to be thorough with you about what we're declining. $5 million, net of my fees at 33% contingency, leaves you with $3.3 million. That is generational wealth. That is security for the rest of your life without further risk. I understand the number. I know you do. I also know what I think we can get in court. I just want you to make this decision with clear eyes, and I want to have it on record that I gave you the math. It comes with silence, Mara said. I've been invisible for 19 years, Soren. I'm not paying for that. Understood. Her voice gained an edge that was something close to fierce. Then we go to the hearing on Monday, and we make them bleed for every inch. The federal courthouse in Billings was a building that knew what it was, limestone and glass, and the American flag snapping above the entrance in a January wind that hadn't decided yet whether it was done for the season. Mara sat beside Soren at the plaintiff's table on Monday morning, wearing clothes Elda had found for her, a dark blazer and wool trousers, the kind of clothes that said she was serious without saying she was trying to look serious. The Halcyon legal team filled their side of the courtroom the way expensive legal teams tended to fill space, deliberately, with the arranged confidence of people whose preparation had been funded by a corporation that treated litigation costs as a line item in a larger budget. For attorneys at the table, 2 more in the gallery. Their lead counsel was a man named Warwick Dade, nationally recognized in mineral rights litigation, silver-haired, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who made being correct feel like a personal failing of whoever stood against him. Judge Harriet Voss called the hearing to order at precisely 9 and dispensed with pleasantries in a single sentence. She was 63, a Carter-era appointment who had spent decades making short work of cases that tried to be longer than they needed to be. We're here on plaintiff's motion for preliminary injunction and defendant's motion to dissolve, she said. Ms. Patel, you're seeking to halt the defendant's federal land operations pending resolution of the underlying claims. Tell me why I should let that stand. Soren stood. She didn't use notes. Your Honor, the plaintiff's claim rests on 3 documented facts. First, that the geological survey data underlying the defendant's 2003 federal land permit application was derived, without authorization, from survey work conducted on the Voss private parcel by the plaintiff's grandfather in 1991. Second, that the defendant had direct knowledge of the Voss survey through physical access to the property during exploratory drilling conducted without the landowner's consent in the early 1990s. Third, that the defendant has continued to use and develop this data in active federal land operations up to the present day, making the underlying harm not historical but ongoing. Warwick Dade had the practiced ability to look attentive and unimpressed simultaneously. He stood when Judge Voss turned to him with the ease of someone who had stood in exactly this posture many times. Your Honor, the plaintiff is asking this court to halt a legitimately permitted federal operation based on a 30-year-old dispute that her grandfather already litigated and lost in county court in 1999. The geological data in our client's permit application was derived from independent survey work conducted by licensed professionals at the direction of our client. The plaintiff has produced core samples from a private residence with no documented chain of custody, a single affidavit from a retired state assessor whose internal note, 30 years old, was reviewed and dismissed by his supervisors at the time, and a letter written by a deceased man who cannot be cross-examined. Judge Voss looked at the letter. The letter was notarized and witnessed. It was, Your Honor. that establishes its existence. It does not establish the truth of its contents. Ms. Patel. Soren stood again. Your Honor, the defendant's argument requires the court to believe that their 2003 federal permit application, which references Buchanan County geological formation patterns consistent in every measurable parameter with the Voss parcel survey, was derived from independent survey work that no one has been able to produce in discovery. We requested all geological survey work underlying that application. The defendant produced 2 pages of summary notes and asserted that the originals had been destroyed in a company records consolidation in 2011. She placed a document on the record. What they did produce, in response to our document request, was an internal email from 1994 referencing the Voss parcel by name in connection with planning for the federal permit application. That email was produced in the 4th document batch, buried in 17,000 pages, and was not flagged or indexed. She paused to let that land. Either their litigation team failed to review their own production for relevance, or it was produced inadvertently. Either way, it is in evidence. Dade stood without being invited. Your Honor, sit down, Mr. Dade. Judge Voss had picked up the document Soren had placed on the record and was reading it. The courtroom was very quiet. This email references the Voss parcel. It references a county designation that may correspond to multiple parcels, Dade said, back on his feet. It references Voss survey data, confirmed commercial grade, Northeast Ridge. The Voss parcel is the only parcel on the Northeast Ridge with a confirmed survey from that period. Judge Voss set the document down. She looked at Dade for a moment. Mr. Dade, I'm going to ask you a direct question and I'd like a direct answer. Has your client ever conducted any physical survey or sampling activity on the Voss private parcel? A silence that lasted slightly too long. Your Honor, I would need to consult with my client on that specific question. Then consult. Judge Voss was already making notes. We'll recess for 45 minutes. Mara sat at the plaintiff's table during the recess and felt the room's energy differently than she had at the start of the morning. Soren was writing steadily, not celebrating, but the set of her shoulders had changed, slightly, like someone who has found footing on uncertain ground and knows it. The email, Mara said quietly. I found it at 11 o'clock Friday night. Soren didn't look up from her notes. 17,000 pages. It was on page 11,432. You read all 17,000 pages. I had a paralegal for the first 12,000. They were called back in 40 minutes. Dade stood with the recalibrated composure of someone who had been having a difficult private conversation and was now presenting a public face over the evidence of it. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that in the early 1990s, certain exploratory survey activities may have been conducted in Harlan County that extended onto private land. My client's position is that this was unintentional and the result of inaccurate GPS data available at the time, which was before the civilian precision improvements of the late 1990s. So your client is now acknowledging physical survey activity on the Voss parcel. A breath. Acknowledging the possibility, yes, Your Honor. Judge Voss looked at him with the expression of someone who had been lied to with great technical skill for several hours and had decided not to be further lied to. The preliminary injunction is upheld, she said. The defendant's operations on the adjacent federal parcel are halted pending resolution of the underlying claims. I am also referring the matter of the 2003 permit application to the federal attorney's office for review of potential fraud on the permitting process. She closed the folder in front of her. Counsel, I would strongly encourage your respective clients to discuss resolution before the next hearing date. This court schedule is full, and these facts are not going to improve with age for your client, Mr. Dade. She left the bench. Mara sat for a moment in the courthouse's complicated silence after the gallery began to move. She looked at her hands on the table, the same hands that had held August's letter in the cold of the hidden room 3 weeks ago, reading 6 pages of apology and instruction and quietly enormous love from a man who had run out of time. She felt the words of his letter the way you feel a landmark, not all at once, but as you move past it and understand what it's marking. Soren touched her arm. Come on, let's go outside before the press gets organized. They stood on the courthouse steps for exactly 3 minutes before the reporters found them. Soren gave a brief statement, precise and without rhetoric. The court had upheld the injunction. The evidence established what the plaintiff had always maintained. The case would proceed, and the plaintiff looked forward to presenting the full record of what had occurred. Someone asked Mara what she felt. She thought about it for a moment, which was not what they expected. "My grandfather was right," she said. "He was right for 30 years and nobody would confirm it. Today a federal judge confirmed it." She looked at the recorder in front of her. "That matters more to me than any number." Halcyon stock dropped 4% by market close that day. By the end of the week, 2 former employees of Halcyon's predecessor company had contacted Soren independently through separate channels, indicating they had information relevant to the case and asking about the terms for cooperating witnesses. One of them was a crew supervisor from the 1992 and 1993 drilling operations. He had, he said, a field log from the period, personal and unofficial, the kind workers sometimes kept for their own records, that noted the locations of each day's drilling and coordinates he'd recorded from his own GPS unit rather than from the falsified company documents. The second call was from a geologist who had worked on the 2003 federal permit application and had been told by her supervisor at the time that the geological formation data was derived from licensed survey work. She had signed off on the application in good faith. When she'd read the Tribune article and seen the specific technical description of the formation data, she had recognized it as the same data she'd been given for the 2003 application. She was angry in the specific way of someone who had been used and had needed a reason to understand that the use was not their responsibility. Soren added both to the witness list on a Thursday morning and filed an amended complaint that incorporated their forthcoming testimony. The filing was picked up by the legal press. By Friday, it was in the general press. The pattern that had been visible in August's files, the careful, systematic mining of a private landowner's geological work and its deployment in federal permit applications, was now corroborated by 3 independent sources across 3 separate decades. The settlement offer that arrived the following Monday was $25 million. It still included a confidentiality agreement. Mara told Soren her answer before Soren finished reading the email. "I know," Soren said. "What do? We prepare for trial. Discovery continues. We take depositions from Halcyon's executives, including the people who authorized the original drilling operations and the people who approved the 2003 permit application. We build a trial record that is so complete and so damning that the cost of taking it to a jury becomes genuinely dangerous for them." A pause, and we wait for the number that reflects what this is actually worth. The depositions took place over 6 weeks, in conference rooms in Billings, and once in a hotel meeting room in Helena when a Halcyon executive refused to travel. Mara sat through most of them, not because she was required to, but because she'd decided that bearing witness was part of what she was here to do. She watched Soren work through corporate executives with a methodical patience that was different from aggression, a quieter and more effective thing, the patience of someone who had read every document and was prepared to sit in a chair for 8 hours asking questions until the answers matched the record. What emerged from the depositions was what the documents had always suggested and nobody had been willing to formally confirm. A company that had found something enormously valuable on land it didn't own, and had spent 3 decades engineering circumstances to ensure it would eventually be able to take it without paying a fair price. Not through violence or dramatic fraud, but through the accumulated weight of legal challenge, financial pressure, reputational damage, and the simple arithmetic of waiting. They had waited. August had refused to give up, and he had died before he could see the refusal matter, and the calculation had seemed to hold. Except that he had spent 30 years building something instead of simply holding a position, and what he'd built had outlasted him, and it was sitting now in a courtroom record in Billings, Montana, with the weight of 3 decades of meticulous documentation behind it. Elda called one evening in March, her voice carrying something different in it, something lighter. "Vera Coleman's daughter called me," she said. "The family that sold land adjacent to August back in 1999. The daughter found out about the suit. She wants to know if there's anything they can do." "What do you mean?" "Whether they have a claim of their own. Whether the same thing was done to them." Mara sat with that. "Tell her to call Soren." 3 other families contacted Soren's office over the following 2 weeks. All of them from Harlan County or adjacent counties. All of them with land bordering formations that matched the geological record in August's files. All of them with some version of the same story. An offer they couldn't quite afford to refuse, a legal challenge they couldn't afford to fight, a company that had been patient in exactly the way of something that could afford to wait. Soren filed an amended complaint adding a class action component in April. The story got larger. Halcyon's lawyers filed a motion requesting the class action be severed from the primary suit. Judge Voss denied it. Their stock fell another 6%. The settlement offer that arrived in April was $60 million, still with a confidentiality agreement. Mara sent the same answer. May brought the trial date confirmation, a federal jury trial set for September, 7 months away. The announcement ran in the financial press with language about significant exposure for Halcyon and the phrase potential landmark ruling in mineral rights law in 2 separate articles. The company's board issued a statement reiterating their commitment to legal compliance and responsible resource development. 3 sentences that said nothing and had to be said anyway. What came next surprised Soren, which was notable because very little surprised her. In June, a different law firm called. Not Halcyon's usual team. A firm from New York that Soren recognized as specializing in corporate resolution, the kind of firm you engaged when you needed to settle something serious and your current lawyers had accumulated too much adversarial history to be useful. The senior partner asked for a meeting. He flew to Billings and met them in Soren's office on a Tuesday, without much preamble and without the pleasantness that had characterized Reed Calder's approach in January. He was there because his client's legal exposure had become structurally threatening. The class action component, the cooperating witnesses, the federal attorney's referral on the permit fraud, the documented email, the 37 site surveys, Medler's statement, the 2 additional former employee testimonies. The accumulation had created a trial risk that Halcyon's board had concluded was unacceptable. He placed a figure on the table. $220 million. Structured as a combination of mineral rights purchase at fair market value, civil damages for the unauthorized use of proprietary geological data, and a contribution to a remediation fund for the class action participants. No confidentiality agreement. A public statement by Halcyon acknowledging the survey activity on the Voss parcel and describing it as a violation of the landowner's rights. Mara looked at the figure on the paper for a long moment. She thought about Reed Calder in the library. About $300,000 presented as something too good to refuse. About the sequence of offers climbing from $22,000 in 1992 to $300,000 in January to $1. $5 million to $5 million to $25 million to $60 million to this. The same resource, the same land, the same truth. The only thing that had changed was the company's assessment of what ignoring it would cost them. She looked at Soren. Soren's face was doing the thing it did when she had a position, but was ensuring the choice belonged to the person whose life it was. The class action participants, Mara said, included in the fund. Their individual amounts would depend on the extent of their claims, but the structure covers them. The New York partner's voice was even. The public acknowledgement is real. It will be issued as a press release and filed in the court record. Halcyon's legal team fought that component considerably harder than the money. I know they did, Mara said. She thought about August's letter. Make them admit what they did. Not for me. I'll be past caring. She thought about the specific quality of being told you were wrong for 30 years. She thought about Elda Marsh keeping a fire lit through 6 months of a Montana winter on the chance that someone would follow the smoke. I want one change to the public acknowledgement, she said. The partner looked at her. The statement needs to name my grandfather specifically, August Wilhelm Voss. It needs to say that the survey activity began on land belonging to August Voss in 1991, that he identified the violation and sought legal remedy, and that the failure to resolve the matter during his lifetime was a failure on the company's part. She kept her voice level. He's not a footnote in a settlement document. He's the reason this exists at all. The partner glanced at his notes. I'll need to confirm that language with my client. Confirm it. He called his client from Soren's conference room and came back 20 minutes later. Agreed, he said, with minor editorial adjustments to the specific phrasing. I'll review the final phrasing before I sign anything, Soren said. Of course. The agreement was finalized over 3 weeks of careful drafting, Soren reading every line, Mara reviewing the sections that concerned the public statement. There were 4 rounds of language negotiation over the description of August's role, each round requiring Soren to hold the line against Halcyon's instinct to soften and generalize. She held it. The final language was specific. August Voss. His land. His discovery. His 30 years of documentation. His name. Mara signed on a Wednesday afternoon in Soren's Billings office. The conference room table long and the June afternoon visible through the window. The mountains in the distance the same mountains they'd always been, unimpressed by human arrangements. The settlement check, after Soren's fee and the class action fund contribution, was $146 million to Mara Voss, sole heir of August Wilhelm Voss, age 19, of Harlan, Montana, formerly of Cedar Ridge Women's Shelter, formerly of 12 foster placements across the state, formerly of a 2004 Honda Civic with a grinding engine and a quarter tank of gas. Halcyon's public statement issued 2 days after signing, picked up by wire services within an hour. The Tribune ran a follow-up by Caroline Marsh under the headline, Energy Company Admits to Survey Violations on Montana Land. Orphan heir receives settlement in landmark mineral rights case. The story was picked up by more than 100 outlets by the end of the day. Priya Sinha called to say she'd been asked to peer review a paper on the deposit formation for a geological journal, and the paper's author had asked for permission to cite the case. Francis Medler called to say he'd been to August's grave and had felt, for the first time in a long time, that he'd done something worth doing. Elda called and said nothing at all for a moment when Mara told her, just breathed on the line in the quiet of her kitchen on Birch Street, and then said, he would have been insufferable about being right. Mara laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that comes out before you decide whether it's appropriate. Reed Calder did not call. The families in the class action component received their assessments over the following month, the amounts varying with the extent of their individual claims. Vera Coleman's daughter, whose family had sold in 1999 under pressure, received enough to retire the debt that had been following her family since. 2 other families whose land had been accessed during the same survey period received similar amounts. There were 6 families in total. None of them had known, until this year, exactly what had been done to them. Most of them had known that something felt wrong about how it had all happened, but hadn't been able to prove it. Now it was proved. In the court record, in the settlement document, in the press release bearing Halcyon's corporate name and the specific language Mara had required. She kept the land. That had never been in question for her. Even in the conversations about settlement structure, even when a Halcyon attorney had floated the idea of a land purchase as a component of the resolution. The 180 acres were not for sale. They were not a commodity to be exchanged for a cleaner transaction. They were what August had spent his life on, and they were what had made all of this possible, and she was keeping them the way you keep the thing that matters most regardless of what's offered for it. She hired a structural engineer to assess the cabin in July. The report was good. The foundation was original stone, solid. The frame was post and beam, massive old-growth timbers that would outlast the century. The roof and walls needed proper work, which she arranged to have done before the following winter, using contractors from Harlan who drove out in a convoy of pickup trucks one morning and worked steadily through the summer with the efficient competence of people who had been doing this kind of work in these mountains their whole lives. She moved out of Cedar Ridge Women's Shelter on a Thursday in late June, the day after the settlement signed. She thanked the case manager, the woman who had said sustainable path forward in the measured voice of low expectations, and she meant it honestly. The shelter had been what was available when nothing else was, and it had been enough to hold her while she found her footing. She rented a place in Harlan for the summer, a small house 3 blocks from Elda's, and worked on the cabin on the days the contractors weren't there, doing the work she could do herself, the smaller repairs, the cleaning and clearing, the rehabilitation of the garden on the south side that August had evidently maintained until his last year. She found seeds in tins in the root cellar, heirloom varieties she looked up online, and started in trays on the kitchen windowsill in August. She enrolled in the architecture program at Montana State in Bozeman for the fall semester. She'd been accepted the previous spring on the basis of a portfolio she'd assembled over 2 years of afternoons in the library, drawings she'd made in the margins of notebooks and on the backs of old receipts, careful detailed renderings of buildings that interested her. The acceptance letter had arrived in April, during the middle of the legal fight, and she'd looked at it once and set it aside and looked at it again every few days, holding it the way you hold something you're afraid to trust. She was going. She would commute on weekends to keep working on the cabin through the fall, the drive from Bozeman to Harlan taking about 2.5 hours on clear roads. She had a plan for what she wanted to do with the property in the long term, a plan that had been forming since she'd stood in the hidden room for the first time and understood what August had built. Not a mine, not a resource extraction operation, something that preserved the geological significance of the deposit while making it accessible to people who wanted to understand it, a combination of a conservation easement and educational use that she'd been developing with an organization in Bozeman that specialized in exactly that kind of land stewardship. The Alexandrite specimens, after gemological authentication and appropriate cataloging, would be donated to the Montana State Geological Collection, except for the large central stone, which she'd decided to keep in the foam-padded crate in the hidden room because some things were worth keeping for their own sake. There were things she did with money in the first year that she'd thought about in the abstract for a long time, and that felt, when she did them, both larger and smaller than she'd expected. She established a fund at Cedar Ridge Women's Shelter, enough to cover operational costs for a decade and fund the transition support for young women aging out of foster care in Harlan County. She named it after nobody. It was just a fund with a purpose. She found the 2 caseworkers from her childhood who had told her she had no living relatives, and she wrote each of them a letter, not accusatory, just factual, describing what had actually been the case. She sent each letter with a copy of the settlement press release. She received one response, from a woman who was now retired, who wrote back a careful and genuine apology. She received nothing from the other. Both outcomes felt like completion in different ways. She went to August's grave on a clear October morning, driving out to the county cemetery in the first sharp light of fall, the aspens having turned and the mountains beyond them the dark green-gray of lodgepole pine against early sky. The grave marker was simple, his name and dates, the stone modest in the way of a man who had not spent money on appearances. She stood there for a while without performing anything, just standing, the way you stand in a place that matters. She thought about what he had been, as far as she could reconstruct it. A stubborn and proud man, according to Elda, who had loved a piece of land and refused to be separated from what was underneath it. A man who had failed to reach her in the ways that mattered most, not from malice, but from a combination of circumstance and the limits of fighting on multiple fronts at once. A man who had left a fire lit in the stove on the chance that she'd come. She thought about what it would have been to know him, to have had a grandfather in the way other people had grandfathers, someone to call on certain kinds of days, someone who knew your family's specific weight of stone and forest and refused to offer. She would not pretend it didn't matter that she hadn't had that. It mattered. It mattered in the specific ongoing way of things that had been possible and weren't, a door you could see but not open. But she had the land. She had the fight he'd built and the evidence he'd assembled and the name he'd cleared and the stones in the foam-padded crate. She had the cabin, restored now and solid, the roof tight and the foundation repointed, and the hidden room behind the paneled wall still there, still accessible, still holding the numbered metal boxes in their careful rows. She had walked into a clearing in January following smoke and found everything he'd prepared for her, and she had carried it forward in the way he'd believed she would. That was something. It was not the same as knowing him. It was something. She drove back to Harlan in the October morning and stopped at Elda's house on the way through. Elda made coffee without being asked, put it on the kitchen table, and sat across from Mara with the comfortable ease of someone who had been in these particular chairs in this particular kitchen through a long span of things. How was it? Elda said. Good, Mara said. I think he'd be insufferable about being right. Elda's expression shifted into something that was almost a smile. He absolutely would. They drank their coffee in the quiet of a Tuesday morning in Harlan, Montana, with the mountains outside the window doing what mountains did, which was simply being what they were, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the particular arrangements that human beings made in their shadow. Later that week, Mara drove out to the cabin for the last time before winter closed the road. She walked through the trees from Old Logging Road, her boots knowing the path now, the red cloth markers from January still tied to 3 trees, faded from months of weather but still visible. The clearing was the same as it always was. The cabin stood in it the way it had always stood, dark and patient and entirely itself. She built a fire in the stove and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the clearing and the tree line and the sky above the ridge, and she let the warmth come up around her the way warmth came up in that stove, slowly, then completely. She thought about January, about a morning that had started like all the others and had turned because she'd looked up at the right moment and seen something thin and gray rising against a winter sky and had chosen to follow it instead of walking past. She thought about what August's letter had said. What happened here was not unusual. Companies do this. That was the thing she intended to do something with. Not the money, which was real and significant and would shape her life in ways she was still discovering. The other thing, the fact that what had happened here was not a singular event but a structure, repeated in different variations across different counties and states and decades, targeting different families, relying on the same arithmetic of poverty and isolation and institutional indifference. She was going to study architecture because she'd always wanted to, and because the discipline of understanding how structures held or failed felt like useful knowledge in more context than buildings. She was going to keep working on the land because it was hers and because August had believed the land itself was worth protecting. She was going to use the resources available to her to make the kind of noise that made what Halcyon did harder to replicate. Not a campaign, not a crusade, just the consistent, deliberate application of presence and resources and refusal to be quiet about things that should be said. The fire was settled, and even in the stove when she left, banked correctly, burning low. She locked the door behind her. She stood in the clearing for a moment in the October cold and looked at the cabin, at its dark walls and steep roof, and the chimney going cold above it. And she thought about smoke rising on a January morning, thin and pale against a gray sky, marking a place that had been here all along, waiting for someone to stop walking past it. Then she walked back through the trees to Old Logging Road, her boots crunching on the first thin frost of fall, the mountains holding the light in the west the way mountains hold everything, carefully and without apparent effort, for whatever time they decide is necessary. The road was clear ahead of her. She followed it home. August Voss found the first stone on a Tuesday in October of 1988, 3 years before he paid for the geological survey, 7 years before the lawsuit, and 35 years before his granddaughter stood in the clearing and read the note he'd left on his own doorstep. He'd been clearing deadfall along the northeast ridge after a wet summer had brought down 4 old lodgepoles across the drainage path. Hard work, the kind that occupied the body completely and left the mind free to go where it wanted, and his mind had been going where it always went in those years, to the mortgage payment due at the end of the month and the price of diesel and the long-range forecast that suggested another dry spring ahead. He was 46. His wife Margaret was at the house making something with the last of the summer squash, and the mountains above him were going the red-orange of October hardwoods, and the air carried that particular clarity it got in the fall, sharp and cold and clean in the back of the throat. He nearly stepped over it. It was sitting at the edge of a root ball where the deadfall had pulled the earth up, exposed by the disruption to a depth of about 2 feet, the size of a large walnut. Green-gray on the outside, the unremarkable color of any rock that had spent decades in soil. He picked it up because its weight was wrong, heavier than it looked, with the specific density of something that had been compressed rather than accumulated. He held it up in the October light. The surface was waxy in a way that granite wasn't, a slight luster under the dull exterior. A corner of it caught the afternoon angle and showed a translucency at the edge, light passing into the stone rather than bouncing off it. He turned it. The translucency shifted. He turned it back. He put it in his jacket pocket and kept clearing deadfall. That night he showed it to Margaret, who held it under the kitchen light, and turned it, and said it was pretty and asked if he wanted more squash soup. He set it on the windowsill and looked at it periodically for 2 weeks without knowing what he was looking at. The second week, a friend came through for dinner, a man named Lou who had spent 20 years in the mining industry before retiring to raise cattle 3 ridges over, and Lou picked the stone up from the windowsill while they were waiting for Margaret to finish with the potatoes and went very quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. "Where'd you get this?" he said. "Off the northeast ridge. Root ball." Lou turned the stone under the lamp. His expression was the expression of someone keeping something off their face. He said, and set it back on the windowsill, and August watched him set it down and knew immediately that the specific care with which he placed it was the care of a man who wanted to appear uninterested. What is it? August said. Hard to say without a proper look. Could be chrysoberyl. Hard mineral, heavier than it appears. Often nothing valuable. Lou sat down. Could also be something worth having tested. August had it tested in Billings the following spring, paying for the analysis himself, saying nothing to anyone except Margaret, who asked what was in the envelope he'd taken to the post office, and accepted his answer of rock samples with the patience of a woman who had been married to him for 22 years. The test result came back in 8 days. Chrome-bearing chrysoberyl. Alexandrite. The accompanying note from the analytical laboratory used language that was professionally careful, noting that a single specimen was insufficient for deposit assessment, that further survey work would be required to establish whether the property contained a commercially significant formation. But the final paragraph said that the specimen was of high quality, gem grade, and that if similar material was present in sufficient volume, the value would be substantial. August put the letter in the kitchen table drawer and sat at the table for a long time. He did the thing he believed was right first. He called Dominion Energy's regional office, the largest operator in the county, and asked to speak with someone about a potential mineral discovery on private land. He was transferred twice, put on hold for 11 minutes, and finally connected with a man whose job title included the word acquisitions. The man's voice carried the polished indifference of someone who handled a large volume of calls from landowners who believed they had found something. He asked August to send the assay report and the property description and said someone would be in touch. Someone was in touch 6 weeks later. Not by phone. In person. 2 men in a company truck, unannounced, who knocked on the door on a Tuesday morning while Margaret was in town. They had clipboards. They were polite in the specific way of people who have decided in advance how a conversation will end. They looked at the property survey August showed them and noted the parcel size and asked if they could walk the northeast ridge to take some preliminary measurements. August, who had not yet learned certain things about preliminary measurements, said yes. They came back twice more over the following months. Always polite. Always vague about their conclusions. Then the offer started. He'd told the story to Mara in the letter, but the letter had covered the broad outline, the legal fights and the evidence and the instructions. What the letter hadn't had room for was the texture of those years, the slow specific erosion of fighting something that never fought back directly but just kept finding new angles of pressure. The offer of $22,000 had arrived by certified mail. He'd written back declining it. A month later, the same letter came again with a different figure. He'd declined that one too. By the 3rd or 4th round, he understood that the dollar amount was not the point of the exercise. The point was to establish a posture, to make the offer often enough and in official enough looking language that declining started to feel like the eccentric position rather than the reasonable one. He began to understand that they had already surveyed the land more thoroughly than they'd let on, and that the visits to the northeast ridge had not been preliminary at all. He didn't know yet how to prove it. He started the documentation project in the summer of 1993, after the second visit from the company's lawyers about the mineral rights conveyance. He bought the metal boxes from a surplus shop in Billings. He bought the padlocks from a different shop. He built the hidden room himself over 3 weekends while Margaret visited her sister in Great Falls, framing it into the north side of the cabin with the post and beam skill he'd developed over decades of keeping the structure sound, then paneling over it with boards that matched the rest of the interior closely enough to pass without scrutiny. He told Margaret about it in November of that year, sitting at the kitchen table with the first snow visible through the window. He told her everything, the stone and the survey and the company visits and what he'd understood about what they were doing. She listened without interrupting and then was quiet for a long time and then said she wanted to see the hidden room. She stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves, empty then, waiting for what he was going to put in them. "You know this will take years," she said. "I know. And you might not win. I know that too." She looked at the shelves for another moment. "Then you'd better make sure whoever comes after you can finish it," she said, and went back to the kitchen to start the dinner. He thought about that for a long time afterward. Whoever comes after you. Margaret had always been clearer than him about the essential nature of things, the fact that a fight's value wasn't solely in whether you won it yourself. She died in 2001, 8 years before August's health started declining seriously, and he carried that particular clarity of hers as a permanent internal reference point. He wrote the first version of Mara's letter in 2008. He had found Helena's obituary in an online search he hadn't known how to do until a young woman from the county library showed him the computer. He'd sat in the library for an hour after reading it, the screen showing the 4-line death notice, the name and dates and cause, and he'd felt the specific grief of someone who had been given one more chance at something and had missed it by years. He'd gone home and written the letter at the kitchen table, the first draft, rough and longer than it needed to be, and full of things he was working through rather than things he was trying to say. He'd put it away and rewritten it the following week. Rewritten it again in 2011, when the legal situation had clarified enough that he could give specific instructions rather than general ones. Rewritten it one final time in the spring of the year he died, the handwriting slightly inconsistent by then, the hand of a man who knew he was working against a deadline. What he cut from each draft was different. The apologies got shorter each time, not because he felt them less, but because he'd come to understand that apologies without the corrective action behind them were their own kind of weight to put on someone, and he was trying to give Mara tools, not burdens. What got longer each time was the instruction, the specific and practical, the things he knew she would need because he'd spent 30 years learning which things mattered. The last addition to the letter, written in April of his final year, was the last 2 lines of the first paragraph. If you're reading this, you found the cabin the way I always thought you would, which means you have some of your mother in you, and some of me, and that tells me a few things about you already. He'd written it because he wanted her to know, before anything else, that he had thought about who she was, not just what she could do with the evidence. Who she was. He asked Elda to keep the fire lit in the fall, after the first hard frost. He told her about the note on the doorstep, told her to leave it there, that he'd weighted it down with the right stone. He told her about Francis Medler's contact details and Soren Patel's name, and the briefing package he'd asked David Aurelius to send. He had assembled what he could assemble. He had prepared what he could prepare. On the last clear morning of that July, 8 days before he died, he walked out to the northeast ridge along the same path where he'd cleared deadfall 35 years earlier. The walk took longer than it used to. The air was dry and warm, and the mountains above were the deep summer green he had always loved, the color of something that intended to last. He stood at the place where the root ball had been in 1988, the earth long since settled and overgrown, nothing to mark it. He looked at the ground for a moment, at the ordinary, undistinguished surface of it, the grass and the thin soil and the stone beneath, holding what it held with the patience of something that did not need to announce itself. He turned and walked back down through the trees toward the clearing and the cabin and the smoke rising thin and straight from the chimney into the July sky. Someone would follow it eventually. He had made sure of that. He went inside and made coffee and sat in the chair by the window, and outside the mountains went about their ordinary work of endurance, which was the only kind they knew. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.